The galaxy in the early years of M31 lay shattered like broken glass, each fragment reflecting the cost of civil war. 10,000 years would pass before historians dared chronicle the true scope of what had been lost during the Horus heresy. Yet, in those first bitter months after the siege of Terra, the wounds remained raw and bleeding. The Imperium of Man, that grand vision of unity forged by the master of mankind, had devoured itself in fratricide. Upon the golden throne sat the Emperor, his body more corpse than man, sustained only by the suffering of thousands and the desperate hope of billions. The Astronomicon blazed with his will, a lighthouse in the storm of the warp, yet those who dared look upon his form saw only ruin. The greatest psychic mind in human history had been broken upon the altar of his own ambition, torn apart by the blade of his most beloved son. Yet within that broken form, something stirred that had not moved since Horus struck his final blow. The Emperor's consciousness, fragmented across 1,000 psychic planes, began to gather itself with purpose. Not for the first time since his entombment did he turn his sight beyond the veil of reality, but never before had he done so with such desperate resolve. The traitor legions fled through the warp like wolves driven from a kill, their ships bearing the scars of defeat and the bitter taste of failure. Horus was dead, his dream of supremacy reduced to ashes on the throne room floor, and without the War Master's unifying presence, the rebellion had shattered into 1,000 feuding factions. Some sought refuge in the growing maelstrom that would become the Eye of Terror. Others struck out into the void, carrying their hatred like a banner before them. But in the depths of the Imperium, where thought became reality and will shape the very fabric of existence, the Emperor began his greatest working. Not since the creation of the Primarchs themselves had he attempted something so ambitious, so fraught with peril. Yet, as he felt the psychic screams of a galaxy in agony, as he witnessed the corruption spreading like a plague through his once loyal legions, he knew that desperate times demanded desperate measures. The effort began as a whisper, a barely perceptible tremor in the warp that might have been mistaken for the death throes of a dying star. The Emperor's will reached out across impossible distances, stretching through dimensions where cause and effect held no meaning. His target was not a place, but 9 specific souls scattered across the void, his fallen sons, the Primarchs who had chosen damnation over duty. Magnus the Red felt it first, as was fitting for one so attuned to the currents of the warp. The Crimson King stood upon the bridge of his flagship, watching the stars wheel past in their retreat from Terra, when the touch of his father's mind blazed across his consciousness like lightning. For a moment that stretched into eternity, he saw himself as the Emperor saw him, not the proud sorcerer king of Prospero, but a broken son whose quest for knowledge had damned them all. The vision came unbidden, cutting through the barriers that Tzeentch had woven around his mind. Magnus saw the burning of Prospero not as a betrayal to be avenged, but as the inevitable consequence of his own hubris. He witnessed the 1,000 paths that could have been taken, the moments where humility might have saved what pride had destroyed. The weight of it drove him to his knees, his single eye blazing with tears of liquid fire. Aboard his plague ship in the outer reaches of the system, Mortarion staggered as the Emperor's presence washed over him. The Death Lord had thought himself beyond such weakness, his body reshaped by Nurgle's gifts into something that could endure any poison, any disease. Yet his father's love burned through him like the purest flame, searing away the lies he had told himself in the depths of his corruption. He saw the Imperium not as the tyranny he had convinced himself it was, but as the dream of unity he had once helped to build. The vision showed him terror as it could have been, a world where knowledge flowed freely but safely, where the gifts of the warp were used to heal rather than corrupt. He saw his legion whole and unblemished, their devotion to duty unmarked by the stench of decay. The sight of what he had lost, what he had thrown away in his moment of weakness, tore a cry from his throat that echoed through the ship's corridors. Angron felt the touch like a cool hand upon his fevered brow, cutting through the eternal rage that had defined his existence since childhood. The butcher's nails, those cursed implants that had stolen his capacity for peace, fell silent for the first time in centuries. In that moment of clarity, he remembered what it was to feel something other than fury. He saw his gladiator brothers not as they had died in the slave pits of Nuceria, but as they might have lived in a galaxy freed from oppression. The Red Angel wept then, his massive frame shaking with sobs that his legion had never seen. They were tears not of rage, but of profound loss, for the man he might have been, for the father who had tried to save him, for the galaxy that had burned while he pursued his selfish vengeance. In the depths of his pleasure barge, Fulgrim's perfect features contorted as the Emperor's vision struck him. The Phoenician had thought himself beyond shame, his every sensation calibrated for the pursuit of absolute experience. Yet his father's sight cut through the layers of corruption that Slaanesh had wrapped around his soul, showing him the true nature of what he had become. The perfection he sought was revealed as hollow degradation, his pursuit of beauty transformed into an worship of the grotesque. He saw his legion as they had once been, proud warriors dedicated to excellence in all things, not the debased monsters they had become in their quest for sensation. The sight of what his leadership had cost his sons drove him to his knees, his hands clawing at his face as if to tear away the mask of corruption he wore. Perturabo felt the vision like a hammer blow to his bitter heart. The Lord of Iron had wrapped himself in resentment for so long that he had forgotten what lay beneath the anger. Yet his father's sight reached past his defences, showing him not the siege engines and fortifications he had built in service to chaos, but the great works of construction he might have created in service to humanity. He saw worlds transformed not by war, but by architecture. His genius used to build rather than destroy. The Iron Warrior Lord stared at his hands that had designed weapons of unimaginable destruction, and for the first time in memory, questioned whether there might have been another path. Aboard his ship of shadows, Conrad Kurz screamed as the Emperor's vision tore through his precognitive sight. The Nighthaunter's gift had shown him only darkness, only the inevitable decay of justice into cruelty. Yet his father's touch revealed other futures, other paths where justice might wear a kinder face. He saw his legion not as the monsters they had become, but as the agents of order he had originally intended them to be. The revelation that his visions had been incomplete, that hope had always existed alongside despair, drove him to the edge of madness. He had committed so many atrocities in service to what he believed was inevitable fate, yet here was proof that choice had always remained. In the depths of space, Alpharius and Omegon experienced the vision simultaneously, their twin souls resonating with their father's call. The Alpha Legion Primarchs had played so many games of loyalty and betrayal that they had lost sight of their original purpose. Yet the Emperor's sight cut through their labyrinthine schemes, showing them the simple truth they had buried beneath layers of deception, that the Imperium they had worked to undermine had been worth preserving. They saw the Cabal's lies for what they were, recognized how they had been manipulated into believing that chaos could only be defeated through humanity's extinction. The weight of their betrayal, of the loyal imperial forces they had destroyed in service to their alien puppet masters, struck them like a physical blow. And finally, impossibly, the Emperor's sight reached into the realm of chaos itself, touching a soul that all believed destroyed. Horus Lupercal had died upon the floor of the vengeful spirit, his essence seemingly consumed by the chaos gods in their fury at his failure. Yet a fragment of the War Master remained, a spark of the man who had once been the Emperor's most beloved son. That spark blazed into flame as his father's love reached across the boundary between life and death. For a moment that existed outside of time, Horus saw himself not as the chaos gods had shown him, but as he truly was, a son who had been deceived, manipulated into believing that betrayal was the only path to salvation. The weight of what he had done, the cost of his rebellion, crashed down upon him like a collapsing mountain. Across the galaxy, psychers fell screaming as the psychic shockwave rippled outward from the Emperor's working. On Terra, the astropathic choirs burst into simultaneous prophecy, their voices crying out visions of Primarchs, wreathed in light rather than shadow. In the depths of space, ship navigators found their sight momentarily cleared, the warp's chaotic currents smoothing into patterns they had not seen since before the heresy began. The chaos gods felt it too, a tremor of pure anathema that cut across their realms like a blade of starlight. For the first time since their victory seemed assured, doubt crept into their immortal minds. The pawns they had so carefully cultivated, the champions they had spent centuries corrupting, suddenly blazed with the light of their father's love. And on the golden throne, the Emperor's broken form stirred as the last of his strength poured into the working. Blood ran from his empty eye sockets, his breathing grew shallower, yet still he maintained the psychic bridge to his lost sons. The choice was theirs to make, but he would ensure they had the chance to choose freely, perhaps for the first time since their fall. The galaxy held its breath, poised between damnation and an impossible redemption that might yet heal the wounds of 10,000 years. The echo of the Emperor's touch lingered in the warp, like the afterglow of a dying star, and in its wake, 9 souls wrestled with revelations that threatened to unmake everything they had become. The retreat from Terra had transformed from flight into something far more dangerous, a journey inward, where each fallen Primarch faced the weight of their choices without the comfort of justified rage. Magnus the Red stood alone in his sanctum aboard the Photep, his single eye blazing with the fury of a man who had glimpsed the true scope of his manipulation. The great libraries that surrounded him, filled with tomes of forbidden lore, suddenly felt like chains rather than treasures. Every piece of knowledge he had torn from the warp's embrace, every secret he had wrested from reality's hidden corners, now revealed itself as bait in a trap that had taken millennia to spring. Zinch's laughter echoed through the Imperium, a sound like crystal breaking in reverse, and Magnus felt the changer of ways' attention settle upon him like a crushing weight. The demon Primarch had served faithfully, had brought entire worlds into the embrace of chaos through his sorcerous might. Yet now he saw the truth that had been hidden beneath layers of cosmic jest. That every spell cast, every bargain struck, had been another link in the chain that bound his soul. "You showed me knowledge," Magnus whispered, to the darkness between stars, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of bitter understanding. "But you never showed me wisdom." The Crimson King had believed himself the master of his fate, the architect of his own ascension. He had told himself that the burning of Prospero justified any alliance, that his father's ignorance of the warp's true nature had forced his hand. Yet the Emperor's vision had stripped away those comfortable lies, revealing the web of manipulation that had guided his every step since childhood. He saw now how Tzeentch had shaped his very nature from the beginning, the insatiable hunger for knowledge that had driven him to exceed every boundary, the pride that had made him believe he could control forces beyond mortal understanding. Even his attempt to warn the Emperor of Horus's betrayal had been orchestrated, designed to shatter the Webway project and force humanity's reliance on the warp. The weight of it drove him to his knees among his stolen grimoires, his massive frame shaking with the effort of containing revelations that threatened to tear his mind apart. He had been not Tzeentch's ally, but its slave from the very beginning, and every choice he thought freely made had been guided by strings he could not see. Light years away, Mortarion breathed air that no longer burned his lungs with corruption. The Death Lord stood upon the bridge of his plague ship, staring out at stars that seemed cleaner somehow, less tainted by the miasma of despair that had followed him since his fall. Nurgle's gifts still ravaged his form, the bloated flesh, the weeping sores, the stench of decay that preceded him like a herald. But for the first time in decades, he felt something other than the plague god's cloying love. The Emperor's touch had been like stepping into sunlight after a lifetime in the depths of a poisoned well. It had shown him not the tyrant he had convinced himself he served against, but the father who had tried to save him from the very corruption he had eventually embraced. Mortarion saw now how Nurgle had whispered to him in the warp storm, how the plague god had offered salvation from Typhus's treachery, while simultaneously orchestrating that very betrayal. "Endurance," he said aloud, the word tasting strange on lips that had spoken only curses for so long. It had been his legion's watchword, their defining virtue, the ability to persist where others would break, to endure what others could not bear. Yet somewhere in his fall, endurance had become resignation. Strength had become acceptance of corruption. Mortarion raised his scythe, silence, and for a moment considered driving it through his own chest. Would death free him from Nurgle's embrace, or would it simply deliver his soul more completely into the plague god's garden? The Emperor's vision had shown him a path back to the light, but the road seemed impossibly steep, paved with the corpses of all those he had damned in his father's name. Aboard the Conqueror, Angron experienced something he had thought lost forever, the absence of pain. The butcher's nails, those cursed cybernetic implants that had defined his existence since childhood, lay dormant in his skull for the first time in centuries. Without their constant shriek of artificial rage, the Red Angel found himself capable of thoughts that stretched beyond the next kill, emotions that reached past the need for blood. He wept then, his tears carving clean tracks through the dried gore that stained his face. The Emperor's vision had shown him his gladiator brothers not as they had died in the slave pits of Nuceria, but as they might have lived in a galaxy freed from tyranny. He saw Uenomaus teaching children to read, not fight. He saw Libertas tending gardens instead of graves. He saw 1,000 small kindnesses that his rage had burned away, replaced with nothing but an endless appetite for violence. The world-eaters around him stood transfixed, their own nails quieted by proximity to their Primarch's strange peace. For the first time in memory, they looked upon their gene-father and saw not a rabid beast to be followed into slaughter, but a broken man who carried their collective pain. Some wept with him. Others fell to their knees, overcome by emotions they had thought surgically removed. "I chose this," Angron said, his voice barely a whisper. "When the Emperor came to Nuceria, when he offered to free my brothers, I chose death over life. I chose rage over peace. and I have been choosing it every day since." The admission hung in the air like a physical weight. Angron had told himself for so long that he had been forced into rebellion, that the Emperor's failure to save his gladiator family had justified any betrayal. Yet the vision had shown him the truth, that his father had been willing to free the slaves, but Angron himself had demanded they fight to the death instead. His rage had demanded a glorious end over a peaceful beginning, and every atrocity since had flowed from that single, prideful choice. In the depths of his pleasure barge, Fulgrim stared at his reflection in a mirror of living silver, and for the first time in centuries, he was disgusted by what he saw. The Phoenician had crafted his appearance to embody perfection itself, every line of his face calculated for maximum beauty, every movement choreographed to inspire awe. Yet the Emperor's vision had stripped away the illusion, revealing the corruption that festered beneath the flawless exterior. He saw how Slaanesh had perverted his every noble impulse, turning his desire for excellence into an obsession with extremes. The pursuit of perfection had become the pursuit of sensation, and sensation had become an endless hunger for degradation. Every work of art his legion had created in Chaos's service was revealed as a mockery of true beauty, a hollow reflection of the glory they had once embodied. The demon that had possessed him for so long stirred within his soul, its presence like oil upon clean water. Fulgrim had thought himself its master after wresting control from its influence, but the Emperor's touch revealed the truth, that mastery was itself another form of slavery. The demon had simply taught him to corrupt himself more efficiently than any external force could manage. "What is perfection?" he asked the empty air, his voice carrying harmonics that made reality shiver. Once, he would have answered with certainty. Perfection was the fusion of form and function, beauty and purpose united in transcendent achievement. Now he saw only the endless spiral of excess that Slaanesh had convinced him was ascension. Fulgrim placed his hands against the mirror and watched his reflection weep tears of liquid light. The Emperor's vision had shown him what perfection truly looked like, not the absence of flaws, but the courage to acknowledge them and grow beyond them. It was a perfection he had abandoned in his quest for something shinier, something that promised more immediate gratification. On the bridge of his fortress ship, Perturabo stood among the mechanical marvels he had wrought in service to Chaos, and found them all wanting. The Lord of Iron had been proud of his creations once, weapons that could crack continents, fortresses that could withstand the fire of dying stars. Yet the Emperor's vision had shown him what his genius might have built in service to humanity, rather than its destruction. He saw cities that touched the clouds, their spires reaching toward distant suns in hope rather than defiance. He witnessed great works of engineering that preserved life instead of ending it, monuments to human achievement rather than alien subjugation. Every siege engine he had crafted, every wall he had designed to keep enemies out, was revealed as a betrayal of the architect he might have been. "I built them to last," Perturabo said, his voice echoing strangely in the iron cathedral of his ship's bridge. It was true. His constructions were made to endure, to outlast the civilizations that had commissioned them. Yet now he saw the bitter irony in that permanence. The weapons would outlive their targets, the fortresses would outlast their defenders, and all that would remain of his legacy was the capacity for destruction. The Iron Warriors who served him watched their Primarch with careful eyes, recognizing something they had never seen before in their Gene Father's bearing: uncertainty. Perturabo had always projected absolute confidence in his visions, unwavering faith in the supremacy of logic and engineering. Yet the Emperor's touch had shown him that all his calculations had been based on false assumptions, that the very foundation of his philosophy was cracked beyond repair. Light years away, in the depths of space where no stars shone, Konrad Curze screamed as his precognitive gift tore itself apart. The Night Haunter's visions had always shown him darkness, futures where justice rotted into tyranny, where hope curdled into despair. He had built his entire philosophy around the inevitability of corruption, the certainty that all noble intentions would eventually decay into their opposite. Yet the Emperor's vision had shown him other possibilities, other paths where justice might wear a kinder face. The precognitive storm that followed was like nothing he had ever experienced. 1,000 futures blazing through his mind simultaneously, each one offering a different answer to the question that had tormented him since childhood. Was justice possible without cruelty? Some of the visions showed his legion as he had originally envisioned them, agents of order who inspired compliance through the threat of punishment rather than its application. Others revealed paths where his gift of fear might have been used to prevent atrocities rather than commit them. Each possibility was a knife in his heart, proof that the darkness he had embraced had been a choice rather than an inevitability. "I could have been better," he whispered through lips that tasted of blood. The admission was harder than any confession he had ever made. Konrad Curze had wrapped himself in fatalism for so long, had convinced himself that his actions were justified by the visions of decay he witnessed, that acknowledging the possibility of choice felt like dying and being reborn in the same breath. The Night Lords who heard their Primarch's screams felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Void's cold touch. They had followed him because he promised certainty in an uncertain galaxy, the comfort of knowing that their cruelty was necessary rather than chosen. Yet if their Gene Father could doubt, if even Konrad Curze could question the righteousness of his path, then what foundation did any of them stand upon? In the labyrinthine corridors of their ship, Alpharius and Omegon stood face to face for the first time in decades, their identical features reflecting the same devastating revelation. The Alpha Legion Primarchs had played so many games of loyalty and betrayal, had woven so many layers of deception around their true purpose, that they had lost sight of what they were originally fighting for. The Emperor's vision had cut through their schemes like a blade through silk, revealing the simple truth they had buried beneath complexity, that the Imperium they had worked to undermine had been worth preserving. The Cabal's prophecies, those alien whispers that had convinced them humanity must die for chaos to starve, were revealed as manipulation on a scale that dwarfed even their own Byzantine plots. "We were so proud of our cleverness," Alpharius said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of misplaced faith. "So certain that we alone could see the larger game," Omegon replied, completing his brother's thought, as he had done since their creation. They had thought themselves the puppet masters, the hidden architects of humanity's fate, yet the Emperor's touch revealed them as pawns in a game far more complex than they had imagined, their every scheme anticipated and guided by forces that had played with galactic politics since before humanity learned to write. The twins reached out and clasped hands, their identical faces reflecting identical shame. They had betrayed their father, their brothers, their species itself, all in service to a lie wrapped in prophecy. The weight of the loyal imperial forces they had destroyed, the worlds they had delivered to chaos through their manipulations, settled upon them like a mountain of corpses. And finally, impossibly, in the heart of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent to the will of mad gods, a soul that should not exist drew breath that it did not need, Horus Lupercal had died upon the floor of his flagship, his essence seemingly consumed by the chaos gods in their fury at his failure. Yet fragments of the War Master lingered still, gathered like scattered light by forces beyond mortal understanding. The Emperor's vision had touched even here, in the realm where his light should not have been able to penetrate. Horus felt his father's love like a burning brand across his soul, and in that touch he remembered what he had been before ambition and corruption had claimed him. The most beloved of the Primarchs, the son who had stood closest to the Emperor's throne, reduced to nothing by choices made in pride and ignorance. "I was so afraid," Horus whispered to the swirling madness around him, his voice barely audible above the laughter of thirsting gods. He had been afraid that his father would abandon humanity, as he had abandoned so many other projects. Afraid that the Great Crusade would end and leave him purposeless. Afraid that his brothers would surpass him in their father's affections. Fear had made him vulnerable to Chaos's whispers, and Chaos had fed that fear until it became an all-consuming hunger for validation. Every world he had claimed in rebellion, every brother he had turned against their father, every atrocity committed in the name of his cause, all of it had stemmed from the simple, shameful fear that he wasn't worthy of the love he had already been given. Across the galaxy, 9 souls touched by divinity grappled with the weight of revelation. Each had been offered a choice that should not have existed, the possibility of redemption in a universe that rarely forgave, never forgot, and demanded blood for every betrayal. Yet the choice was real, burning in their hearts like a star reborn from cosmic ashes. The question that remained was whether they possessed the courage to reach for it, and whether the galaxy itself could survive the cost of such impossible grace. The first blow against redemption came not from without, but from within. Across 9 ships, 9 fleets, 9 scattered fragments of fallen legions, the same terrible schism began to tear apart bonds forged in brotherhood and tempered in war. The Chaos Gods had not remained idle while their champions wrestled with the Emperor's vision, and now their fury manifested through the very warriors who had sworn fealty to the traitor Primarchs. Aboard the Photep, Magnus the Red raised his hands toward the ceiling of his sanctum, and began the most dangerous working of his long existence, the systematic dismantling of his pacts with Tzeentch. The air around him shimmered with crystalline fire as he reached into the warp itself, grasping threads of fate and possibility that had bound his soul to the changer of ways for millennia. The pain was immediate and absolute. Every fragment of knowledge he had gained through Chaos's patronage turned to burning glass in his mind. Every spell empowered by demonic energy became a brand searing his psyche. Yet Magnus persevered, his single eye blazing with determination that had not burned so brightly since the days before Prospero's fall. "I name you Deceiver," he declared to the swirling vortex of change that was Tzeentch's attention. "I name you Manipulator. I name you False, and I cast off your gifts." The response was swift and terrible. Throughout the Thousand Suns fleet, warriors who had served the Crimson King for centuries suddenly turned their bolters upon each other. Those most deeply touched by Tzeentch's influence found themselves compelled to fire upon their Primarch, their movements no longer their own, as demonic possession overrode their free will. Azek Ahriman, first captain of the Thousand Suns, felt the familiar tug of his patron's whispers. The ancient sorcerer had served Tzeentch faithfully, believing that chaos was simply another form of order, too complex for lesser minds to comprehend. Yet as he watched his gene father writhe in agony, casting off power that had taken centuries to accumulate, something deeper than loyalty stirred in his breast. "My lord," Ahriman said, his voice cutting through the psychic storm that raged around Magnus. "Command me." "Break your own chains," Magnus gasped, his form flickering between flesh and pure energy as Tzeentch's grip loosened. "Choose freely." The simple words carried the weight of revelation. Ahriman looked around at the battle raging through the ship's corridors, saw brothers he had fought beside for millennia tearing each other apart as competing influences seized control of their souls. The choice before him was stark. Serve the god who had promised him ultimate knowledge, or follow the Primarch who had shown him that knowledge without wisdom was merely another form of blindness. Light years away, Mortarion stood in the apothecarian of his flagship, his massive frame racked with convulsions as he began the impossible task of purging Nurgle's gifts from his corrupted flesh. Each blessing of the plague god that he cast off sent waves of agony through his system, as if his very cells were screaming in protest at the loss of their familiar corruption. Typhon, the Death Guard captain who had orchestrated his Primarch's fall, watched with eyes that blazed with demonic light. The warrior who had once been Callous Typhon was long dead, consumed by the demon that wore his flesh. Yet even that ancient entity felt a tremor of uncertainty as it witnessed Mortarion's struggle. "You cannot escape what you are," the thing that wore Typhon's face hissed, its voice layered with harmonics that made reality shiver. "You are death. You are decay. You are the lord of endings, and endings cannot be undone." Mortarion raised his head, and for the first time in decades, his eyes held something other than bitter resignation. "I was the Lord of Endurance before I was the Lord of Death," he said, his voice carrying across the ship's Vox network. "And some things endure longer than gods expect." The words reached every Death Guard throughout the fleet, and in their wake came a choice that many had thought lost forever. Some, too far gone in their corruption, could only snarl and reach for their weapons. Others, those who still remembered what they had been before Nurgle's embrace, felt something stir that they had believed surgically removed. Hope. The apothecarian erupted into violence as brother turned against brother, the ship's corridors running with blood and worse things as the Death Guard tore themselves apart. Yet through it all, Mortarion continued his agonizing purification, casting off gifts that had sustained him through millennia of warfare. Aboard the Conqueror, Angron's moment of peace shattered like glass against stone as the butcher's nails roared back to life. Yet this time, their shriek carried a different quality, not the mindless rage that had defined his existence, but a fury directed at specific targets. The World Eaters who had surrendered completely to Khorne's influence, who had traded their souls for the simple pleasure of endless slaughter, found themselves facing their Primarch's wrath. "You wear my colors," Angron snarled at a squad of berserkers who had raised their weapons against him. "But you do not serve my vision. You serve only blood for the blood god, skulls for his throne. Where is the liberation in that? Where is the freedom we promised the oppressed?" The Red Angel's questions cut deeper than any chains would. The World Eaters had followed him into rebellion, believing they fought for the freedom of the galaxy's downtrodden, for the right to live without the Imperium's crushing boot upon their necks. Yet somewhere in their fall, that noble purpose had been forgotten, replaced by an endless hunger for violence that served no cause save slaughter itself. Captain Khan, the betrayer, felt the familiar whispers of the blood god urging him to strike down his Primarch. Yet as he looked into Angron's eyes, he saw not the rabid beast that had led them for so long, but the gladiator who had died for his brothers in the slave pits of Nuceria. The contradiction tore at his mind. How could he serve both the god who promised eternal war and the Primarch who suddenly spoke of peace? "Choose," Angron said, his voice cutting through the nail's shriek. "Choose freely, for perhaps the first time in your lives. Will you be slaves to an alien god's hunger, or will you be world-eaters once again?" The ship descended into chaos as the Legion fractured along lines that had nothing to do with rank or company structure. Those who retained some memory of their original purpose rallied to their Primarch, while those who had surrendered completely to Khorne's influence sought to drag him back into the familiar embrace of endless rage. On his pleasure barge, Fulgrim stood before a mirror of living silver and began the most painful act of creation in his long existence, the systematic destruction of everything he had built in service to Slaanesh. Each perfect sculpture that embodied corruption was cast into the ship's furnaces. Every symphony that glorified excess was deleted from the Legion's records. Each work of art that had been crafted to inspire depravity was reduced to its component atoms. The Emperor's children who witnessed their Primarch's actions reacted with horror that transcended physical sensation. They had followed Fulgrim not out of duty, but out of genuine admiration for his pursuit of perfection. To see him destroying the very achievements that had defined their Legion's identity was a betrayal more profound than any tactical defeat. "My lord," Lucius the Eternal said, his scarred features twisting with confusion and nascent rage, "what are you doing? These are masterpieces, perfect expressions of our artistic vision." "They are lies," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself weep. "Beautiful lies, seductive lies, but lies nonetheless. We sought perfection and found only perversion. We pursued excellence and discovered only excess." The Phoenician raised his hand, and the demon sword he had carried for so long began to smoke and burn. The blade had been forged from his own essence, a masterwork that embodied everything he believed about the fusion of beauty and function. Yet as the Emperor's vision had shown him, it was also a chain that bound him to Slaanesh's will. "I will be perfect," he declared, "but I will define perfection for myself." The sword's destruction sent shock waves through the Emperor's children fleet as the most devoted of Slaanesh's followers felt their patron's rage. They turned upon their Primarch with a fury that transcended mere anger, seeking to preserve the corruption they had mistaken for advancement. In the depths of space, aboard ships of cold iron and bitter purpose, similar scenes played out across the remaining traitor legions. Perturabo faced rebellion from iron warriors, who preferred the certainty of serving chaos to the uncertainty of redemption. Conrad Kurz fought against Night Lords, who had grown addicted to cruelty, and saw their Primarch's newfound hope as weakness. The Alpha Legion turned their labyrinthine plotting against themselves as competing loyalties tore the Legion apart. Yet through the violence and chaos, something unprecedented began to emerge. For the first time since their fall, the Primarchs began to reach out to each other, not as rivals or allies of convenience, but as brothers united by a common struggle. The first communication came from Magnus, his psychic voice carrying across the void to touch the minds of his fellow Primarchs. "I feel your pain," the Crimson King's thoughts whispered through the warp, somehow finding a path through the demon-infested currents. "I see your struggle. We do not have to face this darkness alone." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 8 other voices joined the mental link, each carrying the weight of millennia of guilt and the fragile hope of redemption. For a moment that stretched across star systems, the 9 Primarchs shared their burden, drawing strength from the knowledge that they were not alone in their struggle. Mortarion was the first to speak aloud what they all felt. "We were stronger together once," he said, his words carrying to his brothers across impossible distances. "Before ambition divided us, before the heresy tore us apart. Perhaps we can be stronger together again." The admission carried a weight that transcended mere strategy. These were beings who had spent centuries locked in competition with each other, each convinced that their vision for the galaxy was superior to their brothers. Yet the Emperor's touch had shown them a truth they had forgotten, that they had been created not as rivals, but as a family. Angren's response came laden with pain, but also with hope. "The nails make it hard to think clearly, brothers. But in the moments when they're quiet, I remember what we were to each other before the galaxy came between us. I remember why Father made us." "To serve," Fulgrim added, his voice carrying a harmony that spoke of genuine emotion rather than artificial perfection. "To protect, to guide humanity toward a future worthy of its potential." "To build," Perturabo said, his words heavy with the weight of untold regrets. "Not to tear down in jealousy and spite." One by one, the Primarchs added their voices to the communion, each acknowledging the role they had played in their own fall. Conrad Kurz spoke of justice perverted into cruelty. Lorgar confessed to mistaking worship for wisdom. Alfarius and Omegon admitted to losing themselves in schemes so complex that they had forgotten their original purpose. Yet even as this unprecedented reconciliation began, the Chaos Gods moved to shatter it. Across 9 fleets, demon princes materialized to challenge the wayward Primarchs directly. Greater demons of all 4 powers descended upon ships already torn apart by civil war. The warp itself seemed to convulse with rage as entities older than human civilization sought to reclaim what they considered their rightful property. The battle for redemption had begun in earnest, and its first casualties were the bonds of brotherhood that had once united the traitor legions. Yet from that fracture, something new was emerging. A different kind of unity, forged not in conquest, but in the shared recognition of failure and the mutual desire to rise above it. The Primarchs, who had once stood as champions of chaos, now faced their greatest enemy, not on distant battlefields, but within their own hearts. The war for their souls had begun, and the outcome would determine not just their fate, but the destiny of the galaxy itself. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, where reality bowed to the will of mad gods, ancient powers stirred with fury that shook the foundations of the Imperium. The game they had played for millennia was changing, and for the first time since the heresy began, they faced the possibility that they might lose pieces they had considered permanently won. The gathering storm was about to break, and when it did, it would wash the galaxy in blood and fire. Yet somewhere in that tempest, 9 souls clung to a hope they had thought forever lost, the chance to be not what they had become, but what they had been meant to be. Redemption demanded blood, and the traitor Primarchs paid it willingly. Across the scattered fleets fleeing Terra's ashes, each fallen son of the Emperor discovered that breaking free from chaos required sacrifices that would have seemed unthinkable mere days before. They were asked to surrender not just power, but pieces of their very identity, to become less than they were in order to become what they should have been. The screaming began aboard the Conqueror when Angren made his choice. The Red Angel stood in the depths of his flagship's medica chambers, surrounded by the primitive surgical equipment that had once maintained the butcher's nails in his skull. Yet now those same instruments would serve a different purpose, not to enhance the cybernetic implants that had defined his existence, but to remove them entirely. "My lord," Captain Khan pleaded, his scarred features twisted with concern that cut deeper than any blade wound. "The nails are integrated into your brain stem. To remove them is to risk everything you are." Angron looked at his most loyal captain, this warrior who had followed him from the fighting pits of Nuceria to the throne room of terror itself, and smiled with an expression Khan had never seen before. It was not the rictus grin of a killer anticipating violence, but the gentle expression of a man who had finally found peace with an impossible choice. "What I am, Khan, is a slave to rage that was never truly mine," Angron said, his voice carrying none of the usual undertones of barely controlled fury. "I have been a prisoner in my own skull for centuries, watching my hands commit atrocities while my mind screamed in protest. If removing the nails kills me, then at least I will die as Angron of Nuceria, not as the Red Angel of Chaos." The Primarch lowered himself onto the surgical table, his massive frame dwarfing the equipment designed for mortal space marines. Around him, the few World Eaters who had chosen to follow their gene father, rather than Khorne's whispers, prepared instruments with hands that trembled, not from fear, but from the magnitude of what they were about to attempt. The surgery began with the screaming of both flesh and metal. Each nail that was extracted from Angron's brain tissue brought with it fragments of neural matter, pieces of memory and personality that had been fused to the cybernetic implants over centuries of integration. Yet with each removal, something else emerged. Glimpses of the man Angron had been before the High Riders of Nuceria had mutilated him. He remembered his gladiator brothers not as corpses left behind in shame, but as family who had died believing in freedom. He recalled moments of mercy he had shown to defeated foes, acts of kindness that the nails had burned away with their constant demand for violence. Most importantly, he remembered his father's face when the Emperor had arrived on Nuceria, not the expression of a tyrant claiming property, but the sorrow of a parent finding his child broken beyond easy repair. The operation lasted 18 hours, and when it was finished, Angron was changed in ways that went beyond the physical. Where once had stood an engine of rage barely contained in Primarch flesh, now lay a giant who wept openly for the first time since childhood. The pain was overwhelming, not just the agony of surgery, but the emotional torment of truly feeling the weight of his actions for the first time in centuries. "I am sorry," he whispered to the World Eaters gathered around his recovery bed, his voice barely audible above the ship's ambient noise, "for what I led you to become, for the innocents we slaughtered in the name of freedom, for turning you into the very monsters we once fought against." The words cut deeper than any weapon. Many of the assembled Space Marines fell to their knees, overwhelmed by emotions they had thought surgically removed, along with their capacity for anything beyond killing. Some wept with their Primarch. Others simply stared in shock at the transformation of the being they had followed into damnation. Yet the cost was immediate and obvious. Angron's physical strength, while still far beyond mortal comprehension, was diminished. The supernatural fury that had made him nearly unstoppable in combat was gone, replaced by something quieter, but perhaps more dangerous. Genuine courage, informed by compassion rather than rage driven by pain. Light years away, Fulgrim faced a different kind of surgery as he prepared to cut the demon from his soul. The Phoenician stood in the center of his private chambers, surrounded by mirrors that reflected not his physical form, but the spiritual corruption that had taken root within his essence. The demon that had possessed him during the heresy still lurked in the depths of his psyche, no longer in control, but far from destroyed. "You cannot be rid of me," the entity whispered, through lips that were his own, its voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself recoil. I am part of you now, woven into the very fabric of your being. To tear me out is to tear out pieces of yourself that you cannot spare. Then so be it, Fulgrim replied, his hands glowing with power that came not from Slaanesh, but from his own indomitable will. Perfection requires sacrifice. If I must become less to become pure, then I choose diminishment over corruption. The battle that followed was fought on planes of existence that had no names in any mortal language. Fulgrim grappled with the demon, not just for control of his body, but for possession of his very identity. The entity had learned his desires, his fears, his deepest longings for artistic transcendence, and it used that knowledge as a weapon against him. Yet the Emperor's vision had shown Fulgrim something the daemon could not understand. That true perfection lay not in the absence of flaws, but in the courage to acknowledge them and grow beyond them. Every offer of easy power, every promise of sensation beyond mortal comprehension was met with the same response, a rejection that came from genuine self-awareness rather than false pride. The conflict tore through the Emperor's children fleet as the psychic shockwaves of their Primarch's internal battle manifested in reality. Ships' hulls cracked along lines that followed no physical law. Artworks throughout the vessels warped and twisted as the competing visions of beauty and corruption clashed for dominance. When it was over, Fulgrim stood victorious, but transformed. The demon was gone, cast back into the warp from whence it came, but it had taken with it portions of his essence that could never be recovered. His perfect features now bore lines of strain that spoke of hard-won wisdom. His voice, while still beautiful, carried undertones of sorrow that had not been there before. Most significantly, many of the artistic abilities that had defined his legion were simply gone. The supernatural charisma that had allowed him to inspire devotion through mere presence was diminished. The precognitive awareness that had made him nearly untouchable in combat was reduced to mortal levels. He was still a Primarch, still a being of immense power and capability, but he was also genuinely humble for the first time in his existence. "I am less than I was," he admitted to the Emperor's children who had chosen to follow him into redemption. But perhaps that is what I needed to become, more than I had been. Aboard his fortress ship, Perturabo faced the most painful sacrifice of all, the destruction of his own genius. The Lord of Iron stood before the greatest war machine he had ever created, a siege engine so powerful it could crack the crust of a planet with a single shot. It was beautiful in its function, perfect in its integration of form and purpose, and utterly devoted to the service of chaos. 10,000 years of work, he said to the empty air, his voice carrying the weight of untold regrets. Every calculation, every innovation, every breakthrough in engineering science, all of it turned to the service of gods who care nothing for creation, only destruction. Perturabo raised his hammer, the massive weapon that had shattered fortress walls across 1,000 worlds, and brought it down upon the control systems of his masterwork. Sparks flew as circuits died, as machine spirits screamed their electronic death songs, as beauty was reduced to scrap for the sake of principle. The Iron Warriors who witnessed their Primarch's actions reacted with horror that transcended mere loss. They had followed Perturabo not just out of duty, but out of genuine admiration for his vision of war as the ultimate art form. To see him destroying the very weapons that had defined their legion's identity was a betrayal more profound than any tactical defeat. "My lord," Warsmith Kroger called out, his voice tight with suppressed anguish, "these machines are irreplaceable. Millennia of innovation, destroyed in moments of... What? Sentiment? Perturabo turned to face his subordinate, and Kroger saw something in his Primarch's eyes that had not been there since before the heresy began. Genuine sorrow for the path they had taken. They are irreplaceable, my son. That is precisely why they must be destroyed. Better that my genius die with me than survive to serve the very forces I was created to oppose. The Lord of Iron moved through his ship methodically, destroying not just weapons but blueprints, data cores, anything that could be used to recreate the instruments of destruction he had crafted in Chaos's service. Each act of vandalism against his own work was like tearing away pieces of his soul, but he persevered, driven by the recognition that some knowledge was too dangerous to preserve. By the time he was finished, the Iron Warriors' fleet was defensively vulnerable for the first time in centuries. The siege engines that had made them the most feared assault force in the galaxy were reduced to scrap metal floating in space. Yet something else had taken their place, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere destruction, a vision of what their engineering skills might build rather than what they could tear down. Far from the material struggles of his brothers, Lorgar faced a different kind of destruction as he stood before the greatest work of his long existence, the Book of Lorgar, the religious text that had corrupted countless worlds and damned billions of souls to chaos worship. The word-bearer Primarch held the original manuscript in his hands, feeling the weight of every word he had penned in service to false gods. I sought truth, he whispered to the empty chapel, where he had written so many sermons in praise of the ruinous powers. I believed that divinity must be worshipped, that power must be acknowledged and served, yet I was blind to the divine that stood before me all along. The book burst into flames that burned with no earthly fire, each page consumed by light that seemed to come from the Primarch's own soul. As the words were destroyed, Lorgar felt a corresponding pain in his chest, as if parts of his own identity were being consumed along with his heretical writings. Every convert he had made, every world he had brought into Chaos's embrace, every soul he had damned in the name of religious truth, all of it was linked to the book in his hands. As it burned, he experienced their suffering as if it were his own, felt the weight of every betrayal he had authored in the name of faith. The word-bearers who witnessed their Primarch's actions fell to their knees in mass supplication, unsure of what god they should pray to, now that their spiritual leader had rejected the very foundations of their belief. Some called upon the Chaos gods for guidance, while others simply wept at the sight of their most sacred text being consumed by its own author. "What do we worship now?" Dark Apostle Erebus demanded, his voice carrying the desperation of a man whose entire worldview had crumbled. If the gods we served were false, if the truths we spread were lies, what remains? Lorgar looked up from the ashes of his book, his eyes blazing with a light that had nothing to do with chaos sorcery. "We worship nothing," he said, his voice carrying across the ship's Vox network. "We serve, we protect, we guide humanity, not toward gods who would devour their souls, but toward the potential that lies within them." The words were simple, but they carried a revolutionary power that shook the foundations of the word-bearer's identity. They had been defined by their absolute faith, their unwavering devotion to powers beyond mortal comprehension. To be asked to serve humanity itself, to find meaning in protection rather than worship, was a transformation so fundamental that many could not accept it. Yet those who could felt a weight lifting from their shoulders, as if chains they had carried for millennia were suddenly broken. They were no longer slaves to alien gods or servants of cosmic forces that cared nothing for human welfare. They were, perhaps for the first time since their creation, truly free. Across the galaxy, The psychic shockwaves of the Primarch's sacrifices rippled through the warp like stones cast into still water. On Terra, the Emperor's tarot began producing readings that defied interpretation, cards of redemption appearing where only damnation had been foreseen, symbols of hope emerging from spreads that had shown nothing but despair for millennia. Astropathic choirs throughout the Imperium burst into prophetic utterance, their voices crying out visions of Primarchs wreathed in light rather than shadow. Navigator houses reported that the warp storms that had raged since the heresy's end were showing signs of stabilization, their chaotic currents smoothing into patterns that hinted at the possibility of easier travel. In the deepest vaults of the Imperial Palace, ancient archives began updating themselves with information that should not have existed. Records of the traitor legions flickered between their current corrupted status and older entries that spoke of honor, duty, and service to humanity's highest ideals. The effect was subtle, but undeniable. For the first time since Horus had raised his banner in rebellion, the Imperium itself began to hope. Not the grim determination that had sustained it through 10,000 years of war, but genuine hope that the wounds inflicted by civil war might someday heal. Yet the cost of this transformation was written in blood across 9 fleets. The internal wars within the traitor legions intensified as those who could not accept their Primarch's changes fought desperately to drag them back into chaos's embrace. Brothers who had stood together for centuries turned their weapons upon each other. The bonds of brotherhood shattered by competing loyalties that could not coexist. Aboard every ship, in every company, the same terrible choice played out again and again. Follow the Primarchs into an uncertain redemption, or cling to the familiar damnation of chaos worship. Many chose the latter, unable to face the magnitude of change required, preferring the certainty of slavery to the uncertainty of freedom. By the time the internal conflicts ended, nearly half of each legion was dead or had fled to join purely chaos-aligned warbands. Those who remained were fewer in number but united by something stronger than mere duty, the shared recognition that they had a chance to become what they were originally meant to be. The traitor Primarchs stood diminished but not defeated, their power reduced but their purpose clarified. They had paid the price for their attempt at redemption in the currency most precious to them. Pieces of their own identity, fragments of their power, portions of their very souls. Yet as they stood amid the wreckage of their former selves, they felt something they had not experienced since before the heresy began. Not the hollow satisfaction of conquest, or the artificial ecstasy of corruption, but the quiet contentment of choices made freely and consequences accepted willingly. The road to redemption stretched ahead of them like a path through fire, uncertain and fraught with perils that might yet claim their lives or their souls. But for the first time in millennia, they walked it as themselves rather than as slaves to forces beyond their control. The galaxy watched and waited, unsure whether to fear or hope for what would emerge from the ashes of the traitor legion's transformation. The fractures that had begun in the hearts of 9 Primarchs now spread like cracks in broken glass, shattering the unity of the traitor legions beyond any hope of repair. What had once been cohesive forces bound by common cause and shared damnation became a chaotic maze of competing loyalties, where brothers who had stood together for millennia now faced each other across unbridgeable philosophical divides. The first great defection came from the depths of the Thousand Suns fleet, where Ahzek Ahriman stood before a gathered conclave of sorcerers who had served Magnus for centuries. The chief librarian's features were drawn with exhaustion, his psychic reserves depleted by the constant struggle to maintain clarity in the face of Tzeentch's whispers. Yet his voice carried unwavering conviction as he addressed his fellow seekers of forbidden knowledge. "Our Primarch bleeds himself white to free us from chains we helped forge," Ahriman declared, his words echoing through the ship's great library. "He tears apart pacts that took millennia to build, casting aside power that lesser beings would kill to possess. The question before us is simple. Do we follow Magnus the Red into uncertainty, or do we cling to the certainty of our damnation?" The response revealed the true depth of the Legion's fracture. Veteran sorcerers who had followed Magnus since before Prospero's burning fell to their knees, tears streaming down faces that had not wept since they first bound demons to their will. Yet others, their souls too deeply intertwined with Tzeentch's designs, raised their weapons and declared their allegiance to the Changer of Ways rather than their Gene Father. "You ask us to abandon everything we have become," snarled Cain, one of the Legion's most accomplished practitioners of temporal sorcery. "Our power, our knowledge, our very identities, all sacrificed for the slim hope that the Emperor might forgive sons who burned his greatest work to ash." "No," Ahriman replied, his single eye blazing with light that owed nothing to chaos sorcery. "I ask you to remember everything we once were: scholars, protectors, guardians of humanity's future rather than architects of its doom." The battle that followed was fought not with bolter and blade, but with powers that reshaped reality itself. Sorcerers who had once shared knowledge freely now turned their arts against each other, the ship's corridors becoming battlegrounds where the laws of physics bent to the will of competing minds. Some fought to preserve their connection to Tzeentch, while others struggled to sever bonds that had defined their existence for centuries. When the conflict ended, nearly a third of the 1,000 Sons had fled to form their own warband, taking with them not just warriors, but irreplaceable artifacts and codices of forbidden lore. They declared themselves the true sons of Magnus, claiming that their Primarch had been corrupted by Imperial lies, and that they alone preserved the Legion's original purpose. Yet those who remained found something they had thought lost forever: the ability to practice sorcery without the constant whispers of demonic influence. Their power was diminished, their spells less spectacular, but they were free to choose their own path rather than follow designs laid down by entities that viewed them as expendable tools. A similar schism tore through the Iron Warriors, where Warsmith Kroger led a massive rebellion against Perturabo's new vision for the Legion. Standing in the ruins of what had once been the Lord of Iron's greatest siege engine, Kroger addressed warriors who had followed their Primarch through centuries of brutal campaigning. "He has destroyed our identity," Kroger declared, his voice amplified by the ship's Vox network. "The weapons that made us feared across the galaxy, reduced to scrap. The knowledge that took millennia to accumulate, cast aside like refuse. He asks us to become builders, architects, creators. But we are Iron Warriors. We were forged for war." The response was immediate and overwhelming. 2/3 of the Iron Warriors' fleet declared for Kroger, their ships breaking formation to establish their own faction dedicated to preserving what they saw as their Legion's true nature. They took the name Iron Disciples, claiming that Perturabo had abandoned the path of iron discipline for weak sentiment. Those who remained with their Primarch were fewer in number, but united by something stronger than tradition, the recognition that their skills could serve purposes beyond destruction. They began the slow work of designing fortifications meant to protect rather than conquer, siege engines intended to break the chains of oppression rather than crush resistance. Perturabo watched his Legion tear itself apart with the stoicism that had defined him since childhood. Yet those who looked closely could see the pain in his eyes. Each departing ship carried with it warriors he had personally trained, knowledge he had personally imparted, dreams he had shared in those rare moments when his defenses came down. "Let them go," he said to those who remained, his voice carrying the weight of millennia. "I cannot force them to choose redemption. I can only hope that in time they will remember what we were meant to be." The pattern repeated itself across every traitor legion, each schism taking a slightly different form, but following the same inexorable logic. Warriors who had defined themselves by their service to chaos could not simply abandon that identity without experiencing something akin to death and rebirth. From the Emperor's children came the Gilded Serpents, led by Lucius the Eternal, who declared that Fulgrim's rejection of Slaanesh was merely another form of artistic expression that would eventually return to its proper form. The World Eaters spawned the Blood Tide, Khornate berserkers who claimed that Angren's newfound peace was nothing but weakness that needed to be purged through violence. The Death Guard fractured into the Plague Vessels, commanded by those Death Guard who saw Mortarian's purification as heresy against Nurgle's generous gifts. The Word-Bearers gave birth to the True Faith, led by Erebus and Cor Farron, who maintained that their Primarch had been deceived by Imperial propaganda and that the Chaos Gods remained humanity's only hope for transcendence. Even the Night Lords split, producing the Terror Cults, war bands dedicated to preserving the Legion's traditions of fear and intimidation without their Primarch's newfound concern for justice. Yet it was the Alpha Legion that proved most instrumental in coordinating the redemption efforts, their vast network of agents and double agents suddenly repurposed from sowing discord to fostering communication. Alpharius and Omegon used their labyrinthine schemes not to undermine Imperial defenses, but to establish secure channels between the scattered fleets of redeeming Primarchs. "The irony is not lost on us," Alpharius said, during one of the encrypted communications that linked the 9 remaining fleets. "We who spent centuries perfecting the art of division now work to create unity." "Perhaps that makes us uniquely qualified for the task," Omegon replied, his identical features reflecting the same mixture of regret and determination. "We understand better than anyone how fragile loyalty can be, how easily turned to betrayal. Now we work to reverse that process." The Alpha Legion's expertise in covert operations proved invaluable in maintaining communication between the Primarchs while avoiding detection by Chaos forces. They established hidden supply caches, coordinated movement patterns that kept the fleets from being trapped by demon armies, and even began infiltrating the newly formed Chaos warbands to gather intelligence on their former brothers' plans. Yet even as the redemption efforts gained coordination, Conrad Kurz remained haunted by visions of failure. The Night Haunter's precognitive abilities had returned in force after his moment of clarity, but now they showed him futures that competed for probability, some where redemption succeeded and the galaxy found peace, others where the attempt only led to greater devastation. "I see us standing before the Golden Throne," he whispered during one of the psychic communions that linked the Primarchs. "Father welcomes us home, and the Imperium is reunited. But I also see us falling to Chaos's final gambit, our attempt at redemption turned against us to damn the galaxy more completely than our original betrayal ever could." The weight of competing possibilities drove Kurz to the edge of madness, his screams echoing through the corridors of his ship as he struggled to determine which futures were most likely to come to pass. His visions showed him specific moments of decision, critical choices that would determine the fate of their endeavor, but the sheer number of variables made prediction nearly impossible. "Every choice creates new paths," he told his remaining Night Lords, his voice hoarse from hours of prophetic utterance. Every decision splits the future into fragments that compete for reality. We walk a razor's edge between salvation and damnation, and I cannot see which side we will fall upon. Yet even as doubt plagued the Night Haunter, the first major breakthrough in the redemption process came from an unexpected source. Magnus the Red, his massive frame racked by the ongoing battle with Tzeentch's influence, suddenly stiffened as something fundamental shifted in his spiritual architecture. The Crimson King's single eye blazed with light that had nothing to do with chaos sorcery, as he felt the last of the major binding agreements with Tzeentch snap like overwrought chains. The price had been enormous. His ability to manipulate time was gone, his mastery over fate reduced to barely perceptible intuition, yet what remained was purely his own. "It is done," he announced through the psychic network that linked him to his brothers. "The primary pact is broken. I am no longer bound to the changer of ways by anything stronger than habit and familiarity." The psychic shockwave of his liberation rippled across the galaxy, felt by every psyker sensitive enough to perceive the warp's deeper currents. On Terra, the Emperor's psychic presence flickered with something that might have been satisfaction, while in the depths of the Eye of Terror, Tzeentch's screams of rage caused entire demon worlds to convulse with frustrated fury. The breakthrough gave hope to the other Primarchs, proof that complete liberation from chaos was possible even for those who had served the ruinous powers for millennia, yet it also attracted unwanted attention, as chaos forces throughout the galaxy suddenly turned their focus toward the fleeing fleets with renewed intensity. More significantly, the psychic resonance of Magnus's liberation reached beyond the warp to touch mortal minds across the Imperium. Astropaths on distant worlds began receiving fragmented messages from the Eye of Terror, communications that spoke not of threats and demands for submission, but of regret, hope, and the possibility of reconciliation. The first confirmed communication reached Terra itself, where a senior astropath collapsed during routine monitoring duties, his mind temporarily overwhelmed by a message that carried the psychic signature of the Crimson King himself. "Father," the message whispered through the astropath's lips, the words barely audible above the constant hum of the Golden Throne's machinery. "I know you cannot forgive what I have done. But perhaps you might allow me to earn the right to serve once more, not as your son, but as your penitent. Not as a Primarch, but as a guardian of the knowledge I nearly destroyed." The effect on the Imperial Palace was immediate and profound. Custodians who had not shown emotion since the heresy's end stood silent with what might have been wonder. Tech priests abandoned their rituals to debate the theological implications of a demon Primarch seeking redemption. Even the High Lords of Terra, those pragmatic administrators who had guided the Imperium through its darkest hours, found themselves questioning assumptions that had seemed unshakable for millennia. Similar messages began reaching other worlds throughout Imperial space, each carrying the psychic signature of a different traitor Primarch. Mortarian's communication reached the plague worlds his legion had once devastated, carrying promises of healing and restoration. Angron's voice touched the slave worlds of the galactic fringe, speaking not of glorious death, but of genuine liberation. The Imperial response was cautious, but unmistakable. For the first time since the heresy's end, official communications began referring to the lost Primarchs rather than the traitor Primarchs, a subtle but significant shift in terminology that suggested the possibility of redemption rather than the certainty of damnation. Yet even as hope began to spread through the Imperium, the Chaos Gods prepared their response to this unprecedented threat to their dominion. The great game that had entertained them for millennia was suddenly in jeopardy, their greatest champions slipping away just as victory had seemed assured. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent to the will of mad gods, ancient powers stirred with fury that shook the foundations of the Imperium. The rebellion of 9 Primarchs was more than mere tactical inconvenience. It was an existential threat to the cosmic balance that had sustained them since the galaxy's youth. The response, when it came, would be unlike anything the galaxy had seen since the heresy itself. Not the subtle manipulations and gradual corruption that chaos preferred, but a direct assault on the very concept of redemption, designed to prove once and for all that those who served the ruinous powers could never truly be free. The war for the souls of 9 Primarchs was about to become a war for the soul of the galaxy itself, and the outcome would determine whether hope could survive in a universe that had forgotten what it meant to forgive. From the ashes of division came unexpected unity, as Space Marines who had hidden their true loyalties for centuries finally stepped into the light. Across 9 fleets, in the deepest holds and most forgotten corners of ships that had served chaos for millennia, warriors emerged who had never truly surrendered their souls to the ruinous powers. They had endured in silence, practicing the ancient rituals of their legions while outwardly conforming to the demands of corruption, waiting for a moment that many had believed would never come. The first to reveal himself was Brother Captain Arvan of the 1,000 Suns, a warrior who had served in the Legion since before Prospero's burning. He stood before Magnus the Red in the great library of the Photep, his power armor bearing the scars of centuries of hidden resistance. Where other 1,000 Suns wore the elaborate crests and mutations that marked their service to Tzench, Arvan's equipment retained the clean lines and scholarly decorations of their legion's original purpose. "My lord," Arvan said, his voice carrying the weight of a confession held back for centuries. "I never stopped believing in what we were meant to be. Even as I watched my brothers embrace the whispers of the Changer, even as I was forced to participate in rituals that made my soul recoil, I remembered Prospero as it was. I remembered why we pursued knowledge, not for power, but for understanding." Magnus looked upon his son with eyes that blazed not with chaos fire, but with genuine emotion, seeing in this scarred veteran a reflection of what his entire legion might have become. "How many others remain true, my son?" "More than you might hope, fewer than we need," Arvan replied. "But we are here, and we are ready to serve the vision you showed us when first we took up arms in the Great Crusade." The revelation spread throughout the fleet as other hidden loyalists stepped forward, each carrying their own story of secret resistance and quiet faith. They had formed clandestine networks within their companies, using the very skills that made them formidable sorcerers to hide their activities from those who would have reported them to chaos-corrupted commanders. These were warriors who had performed the rituals of demon summoning while secretly working to limit the entity's influence. Librarians who had taught forbidden lore while carefully omitting the most corrupting passages. Veterans who had led charges against Imperial forces while ensuring their attacks were less effective than they appeared. Their numbers were small, perhaps 1/10 of each legion's remaining strength, but their quality was exceptional. These were Space Marines who had resisted the most insidious corruption the galaxy could offer, their will tempered by centuries of hidden struggle. Where their corrupted brothers had been diminished by their service to alien gods, these warriors retained the full strength of their genetic heritage. Similar revelations unfolded across the other fleets. Captain Nathaniel Garrow's actions during the flight from Istvan III had inspired more followers than the Death Guard leadership had ever known. Hidden cells of loyalists within Mortarian's fleet emerged to declare their allegiance to their Primarch's new path, warriors who had endured Nurgle's plagues while secretly working to develop cures and treatments. "We never stopped fighting the real enemy," declared Apothecary Kython, one of Garrow's secret disciples. "While our brothers embraced decay, we studied it, seeking ways to heal what corruption had broken. Every plague we were forced to spread, we worked in secret to contain. Every poison we deployed, we developed antidotes for. The World Eaters revealed their own hidden champions, veterans who had learned to resist the Butcher's Nail's influence through meditation techniques borrowed from the warrior lodges of Nuceria. They had maintained the original spirit of liberation that had once defined their legion, secretly providing aid to slaves and oppressed populations, even while officially serving Khorne's endless hunger for blood. Angron showed us that we could choose," said Sergeant Kham, a warrior whose scarred features spoke of decades of internal struggle. "Not just whether to kill, but how to live. Some of us never forgot that lesson." Yet it was within the Emperor's children that the most remarkable transformation occurred. Fulgrim stood before a gathering of his most trusted commanders, his perfect features bearing lines of strain that spoke of the spiritual battle still raging within him. As he prepared to address them, something unprecedented happened. For the first time since his fall, the Phoenician achieved a moment of his former perfection, uncorrupted by Slanesh's influence. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that had nothing to do with chaos sorcery, and everything to do with genuine artistic mastery. Each word was perfectly chosen, each pause calculated for maximum impact, each gesture flowing with the natural grace that had once made him the envy of his brothers. "I remember what we were," Fulgrim said, his words carrying to every corner of the ship through systems that responded to his presence as if recognizing their true master. "Not the perverted mockery we became, but the artisans of excellence we were meant to be. The question before us is whether we have the courage to become worthy of that legacy once more." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Warriors who had hidden their revulsion at their legion's degradation stepped forward to declare their loyalty. Artists who had been forced to create works that glorified excess revealed masterpieces they had crafted in secret, paintings that captured beauty without corruption, sculptures that embodied strength without brutality, music that inspired hope rather than despair. Captain Saul Tarvitz, who had been presumed dead on Istvan III, revealed himself as the leader of an extensive network of loyalists within the Emperor's children. His survival had been kept secret even from Fulgrim, the captain, working from the shadows to preserve what remained of their legion's original ideals. "We are fewer than we were," Tarvitz admitted, "but we remember what art is supposed to serve. Not the artist's ego, not the audience's base desires, but truth itself. Beauty that elevates rather than degrades. Excellence that inspires rather than corrupts." As the hidden loyalists emerged throughout the fleets, the Primarchs began to coordinate their efforts in earnest. The psychic network that Alfarius and Omegon had established became the backbone of a new kind of crusade. Not conquest for its own sake, but liberation from the very forces they had once served. Magnus the Red, his powers diminished, but his purpose clarified, began sharing knowledge that had been hoarded for millennia. Not the corrupting lore he had accumulated in service to Tzeentch, but the pure understanding of the warp's nature that he had possessed before his fall. He taught his brothers how to recognize chaos influence in its most subtle forms, how to resist the whispers that had led them astray. The greatest deception, he explained during one of their communions, was convincing us that power required corruption, that knowledge demanded sacrifice of principles. The truth is simpler. Real strength comes from choosing limitation, accepting that there are prices too high to pay even for ultimate understanding. Mortarion proved particularly receptive to his brother's teachings, the Death Lord's own struggle with Nurgle's influence, giving him insight into the subtle ways chaos worked to corrupt its servants. Together, they developed techniques for purifying chaos corruption that went beyond simple exorcism, methods that addressed the spiritual wounds that made beings vulnerable to demonic influence in the first place. The first test of their coordination came when Mortarion led a strike against a Nurgle stronghold that had been established in a system on the edge of Imperial space. The target was significant, a demon world where the plague god's servants were developing new strains of corruption specifically designed to counter the purification techniques the Death Guard Primarch had been using on his own forces. "We end this where it began," Mortarion declared, as his purified fleet approached the diseased world. "In the laboratory where decay was first mistaken for growth, we will plant seeds of genuine healing." The assault that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had witnessed since the heresy's end. Death Guard warriors, cleansed of Nurgle's influence, fought alongside their corrupted former brothers with a fury that transcended mere tactical necessity. They moved through the demon world's pestilent atmosphere without succumbing to its poisons, their bodies protected not by unnatural resilience, but by techniques their Primarch had developed for resisting corruption at its source. Mortarion himself led the assault on the primary research facility, his scythe carving through demon flesh with strikes that carried not the promise of decay, but the potential for regeneration. Where his weapon touched the corrupted ground, clean earth emerged. Where his breath reached diseased plants, new growth began. The battle's climax came when Mortarion faced a greater demon of Nurgle that had overseen the facility's operations. The entity was ancient beyond measure, its bloated form a living testament to the plague god's generosity. Yet when it struck at the Death Lord with claws that carried the accumulated diseases of 1,000 worlds, it found no purchase. "I know you," the demon hissed, its voice like the sound of rotting meat. "You are mine. You have always been mine. Your flesh bears my gifts, your soul sings my praises." "I was yours," Mortarion replied, his voice cutting through the demon's diseased aura like a blade through fog. "But slavery, no matter how gilded, is still slavery. And I choose freedom." The Death Lord's scythe took the demon's head in a single stroke, and as the entity dissolved back into the warp, the entire facility began to transform. Plague vats became gardens of medicinal herbs. Corruption laboratories became workshops where antidotes and healing compounds could be developed. The very air became cleaner, more breathable, as if the world itself was drawing its first clean breath in centuries. News of the victory spread through both Imperial and Chaos forces like wildfire. For the first time since the heresy's end, a traitor Primarch had not just resisted chaos, but actively defeated it, reclaiming corrupted territory for the forces of order. The psychological impact was enormous, proof that redemption was not just possible but potentially triumphant. On Terra, within the halls of the Imperial Palace, where the greatest minds of humanity grappled with the implications of impossible news, Robuta Guilliman stood before a gathering of his fellow loyalist Primarchs. The Lord of Ultramar's features bore the strain of someone wrestling with concepts that challenged everything he thought he knew about the nature of corruption and redemption. "The reports are confirmed," Guilliman said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great strategium. "Mortarion has not just purged chaos corruption from his forces, but used them to actively destroy a demon world. The psychic resonance of his victory has reached every astropath in the eastern segmentum." Vulcan, the Salamander Primarch's massive frame, radiating warmth that had nothing to do with his forge-born nature, was the first to speak. Then perhaps there is hope, after all. If one of our lost brothers can find his way back to the light, perhaps others might follow. Or perhaps this is the greatest deception Chaos has yet devised, countered Corax, the Raven Guard Primarch's features, hidden in shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source. We have all seen how subtly corruption works. How do we know this is not simply another layer of the same trap that ensnared them originally? Rogel Dawn, the Imperial Fist's Primarch's expression, as unyielding as the walls he was famous for building, provided the pragmatic perspective that had sustained the Imperium through its darkest hours. We evaluate them by their actions, not their words. If Mortarian's forces continue to fight chaos, if they prove their commitment through deed rather than declaration, then perhaps we can consider the possibility of their redemption. The debate that followed would reshape Imperial policy for generations to come. For the first time since the heresy's end, the question was not whether the traitor Primarchs deserved destruction, but whether they might deserve a chance at forgiveness. Yet even as hope began to take root in Imperial hearts, the Primarchs themselves remained focused on the immediate challenges of their transformation. They had won their first victory against chaos, but it had come at enormous cost. Nearly half their remaining forces had been lost in the various schisms and battles that had followed their moment of awakening. "We are fewer than we were," Fulgrim observed during one of their regular communions, "but perhaps that is what we needed to become. Quality over quantity, purpose over power. The few who remain have proven their commitment, not just through words, but through sacrifice." "The real test comes next," Magnus added, his psychic voice carrying overtones of prescience that had nothing to do with Tzeentch's influence. "Chaos will not allow this victory to go unanswered. They will come for us with everything they have, seeking to prove that redemption is nothing but another form of damnation." The Crimson King's words proved prophetic. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent to the will of mad gods, ancient powers stirred with fury that shook the foundations of the Immaterium. The great game had been disrupted, the cosmic balance that had sustained the ruinous powers since the galaxy's youth suddenly thrown into question. Yet the champions they had lost were not gone. They had been transformed into something unprecedented. Not servants of order in the way the loyalist Primarchs were, but something new entirely. Beings who understood both light and darkness, who had experienced the depths of corruption and chosen to climb back toward the light. The galaxy watched and waited, uncertain whether these transformed beings would prove to be its salvation or simply another form of its damnation. But for the first time in millennia, there was reason to hope that the wounds of the heresy might someday heal, and that the scattered children of the Emperor might be united once more in purpose, if not in method. The response came not as whispers in the dark or subtle corruption seeping through vulnerable souls, but as a tide of fury that threatened to drown reality itself. The Chaos Gods had tolerated rebellion before. It was, after all, the nature of mortals to struggle against their bonds, but never had they faced the prospect of losing their greatest champions, not to death, but to redemption. The very concept was anathema to their existence, a challenge to the fundamental order that had sustained them since the galaxy's youth. The first blow fell upon Magnus the Red as he meditated in his sanctum aboard the Photep, his consciousness ranging through the cleansed corridors of his ship. The psychic attack came without warning, a lance of pure change that tore through the warp like a screaming comet. Yet it was not Tzeentch himself who struck. The changer of ways had learned caution from his recent defeat, but one who still served him faithfully. Ahriman the Exile materialized in the chamber like a nightmare given flesh, his form wreathed in the eldritch fires of unbound sorcery. This was not the loyal son who had once served Magnus faithfully, but the bitter exile who had been cast out for pursuing the rubric that had turned his brothers to dust. His single eye blazed with hatred that transcended mere personal grievance. "You cast me out," Ahriman snarled, his voice layered with harmonics that made reality shiver. "Called me misguided, condemned my efforts to save our legion. Yet now you preach redemption to brothers who have fallen further than I ever did." Magnus rose from his meditation, his massive frame seeming to fill the chamber despite its vast dimensions. Where once he might have met sorcery with greater sorcery, now he faced his former son with something more dangerous, perfect understanding of what drove the exile's fury. "I cast you out because I was afraid," Magnus admitted, his words carrying a weight that made the very air tremble. "Afraid that your solution to our curse was the same kind of shortcut that had damned us all. I was wrong about the method, Arzek, but not about the danger. You sought to preserve our brothers, but you lost their souls in the process." The battle that followed was fought on multiple planes of existence simultaneously, where Ahriman struck with the fury of temporal distortion and reality-warping flame, Magnus countered with techniques that drew power not from the warp's chaotic currents, but from his own purified will. Each exchange sent shockwaves through both the material and immaterial realms, the conflict visible to psychers across the sector as two titans of sorcery clashed for the right to define what their legion would become. Yet even as Magnus struggled with his former student, similar battles erupted throughout the redeeming fleets. Mortarion found himself facing Typhus the Traveller, the demon-possessed captain who had orchestrated his original fall to Nurgle's influence. The Herald of Nurgle brought with him a plague fleet bristling with corrupted vessels, each one a floating incubator for diseases that could corrupt entire systems. "You were so eager to embrace Grandfather's gifts," Typhus laughed, his voice carrying the sound of 1,000,000 deaths. "You begged for his blessing when the destroyer hive consumed your ship. Now you spit upon his generosity and expect forgiveness? There is no forgiveness, only the eternal cycle of decay and renewal." Mortarion met his former captain in the void between ships, their battle taking place in the vacuum of space, where only beings of their stature could survive. Where Typhus struck with diseased talons that carried the accumulated plagues of 1,000 worlds, Mortarion countered with techniques that turned corruption against itself, purifying poison into medicine, transforming decay into genuine healing. The Death Lord had learned hard lessons in his journey toward redemption, chief among them that healing required understanding the nature of the wound. He did not simply resist Typhus's attacks, he absorbed them, processed them through organs that had been cleansed of Nurgle's influence, and converted them into antibodies that could protect others from similar corruption. "You never understood Grandfather's true gift," Mortarion said, as his scythe carved through Typhus's bloated form. "Endurance, the ability to persist beyond what seems possible. But you confused endurance with acceptance, strength with surrender. True endurance means choosing to continue even when continuation requires change." The Herald's destruction sent ripples of shock through Nurgle's realm, the plague god's laughter turning to something approaching concern for the first time in eons. Yet even that victory came at a cost. Mortarion's purified form bore new scars, wounds inflicted by corruption so concentrated that they would take years to fully heal. Angron faced his own reckoning when Khan the Betrayer led a massive fleet of World-Eater's berserkers against his former Primarch. The captain who had once been Angron's most loyal son now served as Khorne's champion, his body a patchwork of scars and cybernetic implants that spoke of countless battles fought in the blood god's name. "You were magnificent once," Khan called across the void, his words carried by vox systems that amplified his voice to be heard across entire squadrons. "The Red Angel, the Eater of Cities, the one who showed us that freedom could only be won through strength. Now look at you, weak, peaceful, diminished. You've traded the fury that made you a god for the frailty that makes you merely mortal." The World Eaters that followed Khan were not the disciplined warriors who had once served in Angron's legion, but something far more dangerous. Pure expressions of Khorne's hunger for blood and skulls. They threw themselves at their former Primarch's fleet with reckless abandon, caring nothing for strategy or survival, seeking only the glorious death that their god demanded. Yet Angron met their fury not with answering rage, but with something far more devastating, genuine sorrow for what they had become. The Primarch, who had once been defined by his inability to feel anything beyond anger, now wept openly for the sons who had followed him into damnation. "I taught you this," he said, his voice somehow carrying to every ship in both fleets, despite the vacuum of space. "I showed you that pain could be transformed into rage, that rage could be focused into strength. But I never taught you what to do with that strength once you had won it. I never showed you how to build, only how to destroy." The admission struck deeper than any weapon. Some of the World Eaters faltered in their assault, memories of their original purpose surfacing through the haze of artificial fury. They remembered worlds they had liberated, slaves they had freed, tyrants they had pulled down, not for the joy of killing, but for the satisfaction of justice served. Yet others, too far gone in their corruption, only roared louder and struck harder, unable to process emotions beyond the narrow band that Khorne permitted his servants. The battle that followed was among the most brutal of the entire conflict, brother fighting brother with weapons that had been crafted to end gods. Fulgrim's trial came in a different form, as Lucius the Eternal brought with him not just Emperor's children corrupted by Slanesh, but artifacts and artworks that embodied the very perfection the Phoenician had once pursued. Each piece was a masterwork in its own right, yet tainted by the corruption that had created it. "Look upon what we achieved," Lucius said, his scarred features twisted into an expression that might have been meant as a smile. "Perfect beauty wedded to perfect function. Sensation elevated beyond mortal comprehension. You taught us to seek excellence, my lord. We have simply pursued it further than you had the courage to go." The temptation was enormous, each corrupted masterpiece calling to aspects of Fulgrim's nature that had been forcibly suppressed during his purification. Yet the Phoenician had learned to recognize the difference between excellence and excess, between perfection and perversion. "You have achieved technical mastery," Fulgrim replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the corrupted artworks recoil. "But you have forgotten why mastery matters. Art exists to elevate the observer, to inspire them toward their own greatness. What you have created serves only itself, feeding on sensation without purpose, beauty without meaning." The battle between the two emperors' children was fought as much through competing visions of aesthetic perfection as through blade and bolt. Where Lucius struck with weapons that embodied perverted beauty, Fulgrim countered with techniques that drew upon purer concepts of artistic expression. Not art for its own sake, but art in service to higher ideals. Yet it was not on the material plane that the most crucial battle was fought, but in the depths of the warp itself, where ancient powers moved with fury that shook the foundations of reality. The Chaos Gods had committed more resources to this conflict than any since the heresy itself, drawing upon reserves of power that they had been hoarding for millennia. Tzeentch wove plans within plans, each scheme designed to force the redeeming Primarchs into choices that would damn them more thoroughly than their original fall. Khorne's rage manifested as demon legions that existed solely to drag the wayward champions back into his realm. Nurgle's despair sought to convince them that redemption was impossible, that they should accept the comfort of familiar corruption. Slaaneish's excess promised that they could have both redemption and power, that there was no need to choose between light and darkness. Yet in the heart of that storm, something unprecedented began to manifest. Horus Lupercal's spirit, fragmented and scattered though it was, began to coalesce with a strength that surprised even the Chaos gods who had consumed his essence. The Warmaster's soul, drawn by his brother's struggle, and empowered by the Emperor's distant love, started to reassert itself in ways that defied every law of spiritual existence. "I see you, my brothers," Horus's voice whispered through the psychic network that connected the redeeming Primarchs. "I feel your pain, your struggle, your hope. You fight not just for your own souls, but for mine as well. And I remember why I loved you." The manifestation of Horus's spirit sent shock waves through the Chaos realms, proof that even death might not be absolute when faced with the power of genuine repentance. Yet his appearance also attracted the attention of every demon prince and Chaos champion in the galaxy, all of them sensing an opportunity to claim the greatest prize of all. On Terra, within the Imperial Palace, where the Golden Throne hummed with barely contained power, the Emperor himself stirred as he felt the tide of battle turning against his wayward sons. For the first time since his entombment, he began to take direct action, his psychic might reaching across the galaxy to shield the redeeming Primarchs from the worst of the Chaos assault. Yet every intervention came at a cost. The Astronomicon flickered as vast amounts of psychic energy were diverted to the battle for 9 souls. Navigation throughout the Imperium became treacherous as the guiding light that had sustained interstellar travel for millennia dimmed to barely perceptible levels. Across the galaxy, astropaths collapsed as psychic storms unleashed by the conflict overwhelmed their carefully trained minds. Entire sectors found themselves cut off from communication, their messages lost in the turbulence that surrounded the battlefield where gods and Primarchs clashed for the right to define the future of the galaxy. Several of the redemption attempts faltered under the unprecedented assault. Lorgar, already weakened by his destruction of the Book of Lorgar, nearly fell back into Chaos worship when faced with word-bearers who had achieved genuine divine manifestation through their service to the ruinous powers. Only the intervention of his brother's combined will prevented his complete relapse. Perturabo's resolve cracked when confronted with iron warriors who had built fortress worlds that embodied perfection itself, structures so magnificent that they could only have been achieved through Chaos patronage. The Lord of Iron stood at the edge of abandoning his redemption, tempted by visions of what his genius might achieve if he returned to his former allegiances. Konrad Kurz's precognitive abilities went haywire under the psychic pressure, his visions becoming so contradictory and overwhelming that he nearly lost himself in the maze of competing possibilities. The Night Haunter screamed prophecies that made no sense, seeing futures where redemption led to greater damnation than any fall to Chaos could achieve. Yet even as individual Primarchs faltered, their brotherhood sustained them. Magnus reached out to stabilize Lorgar's wavering faith. Mortarian's steady endurance became an anchor for Perturabo's flagging determination. Angren's newfound peace helped calm Kurz's tormented visions. "We are stronger together," Fulgrim declared during one of their psychic communions, his voice somehow carrying clearly through the chaos that surrounded them. Not because our individual power is added together, but because our weaknesses are covered by each other's strengths. This is what Father tried to teach us during the Great Crusade, that we were meant to be not rivals but brothers. The battle raged for days that felt like centuries, the very fabric of reality straining under the pressure of so many conflicting wills. When it finally ended, the cost was apparent to all involved. 3 of the redeeming Primarchs bore wounds that would never fully heal. 2 had come so close to relapsing that only their brother's intervention had saved them. The fleets that had survived the internal civil wars were reduced to scattered remnants. Yet they had survived, and more than that, they had proven that redemption could withstand even the direct assault of the Chaos Gods themselves. The galaxy had witnessed something unprecedented, the power of genuine repentance backed by unity of purpose, strong enough to resist temptations that had corrupted Primarchs at the height of their strength. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent to the will of mad gods, the ruinous powers faced a truth they had never encountered before. Their champions could be reclaimed, their victories could be undone, their certainty of ultimate triumph was not as absolute as they had believed. The great game had entered a new phase, one where the rules themselves were subject to change, and in that uncertainty, in that possibility of transformation, lay seeds of hope that might yet bloom into salvation, or grow into damnation more complete than any the galaxy had ever known. In the aftermath of Chaos's greatest assault, when the fleets of 9 Primarchs drifted through the void like wounded giants, something unprecedented began to emerge from the darkness. Where once had stood rivals bound by blood but divided by ambition, now gathered brothers united by shared suffering and common purpose. The bonds that the heresy had shattered were being reforged in the crucible of redemption, stronger for having been broken and mended. Magnus the Red was the first to extend his hand across the chasm of ancient grudges, reaching out through the psychic network that connected the scattered fleets. His message was simple, yet it carried the weight of millennia. "Brother, I need your strength." The recipient was Mortarion, the Death Lord whose rivalry with the Crimson King had begun in the earliest days of the Great Crusade. Where Magnus had embraced the warp's mysteries with eager curiosity, Mortarion had viewed them with suspicion and disgust. Their philosophical differences had eventually contributed to both their falls. Magnus through reckless pursuit of forbidden knowledge, Mortarion through stubborn refusal to accept help when it was offered. Yet now, in the depths of their shared struggle against the very powers that had corrupted them, those ancient disagreements seemed trivial beside the magnitude of what they faced together. "I have spent centuries hating what you represented," Mortarion replied, his psychic voice carrying undertones of pain that had nothing to do with physical wounds. "Your easy mastery of forces that repulsed me, your willingness to traffic with entities I knew were dangerous. Yet I see now that we were both seeking the same thing, power sufficient to protect those we cared about. We simply chose different paths to damnation." Magnus's response came laden with the weight of hard-won wisdom. "And both our paths led to the same destination, the realization that power without restraint is slavery, not freedom. Perhaps that is why the Emperor scattered us across the galaxy before reuniting us through the Great Crusade. He knew we would need to learn our individual weaknesses before we could become stronger together." The reconciliation between the 2 Primarchs sent ripples through both their fleets, as warriors who had been taught to view each other with suspicion suddenly found themselves working in unprecedented cooperation. Thousand Sun sorcerers shared purification techniques with Death Guard apothecaries, while Mortarian's expertise in enduring corruption complemented Magnus's knowledge of the warp's deeper mysteries. Together, they developed new methods for resisting chaos influence that neither could have conceived alone. Magnus provided the theoretical framework for understanding how corruption took root in the soul, while Mortarian offered practical techniques for enduring the purification process. Their combined knowledge became a beacon of hope for the other redeeming Primarchs, proof that unity could indeed overcome what individual effort could not achieve. The pattern repeated itself across the scattered fleets as ancient rivalries gave way to genuine brotherhood. Perturabo and Lorgar, two Primarchs whose approaches to their father's vision had seemed fundamentally incompatible, found themselves working together to establish defensive positions against the continuing demon attacks. "I built fortresses to keep enemies out," Perturabo said, as he stood beside the word-bearer Primarch on the bridge of his flagship. "You built faith to keep corruption from entering hearts and minds. Yet both of us forgot the most important lesson, that the strongest fortifications are worthless if those within them have no reason to fight." Lorgar nodded, his features bearing the scars of his recent spiritual battle. "I sought to give our species something to believe in beyond the material realm. You sought to give them structures that could withstand any assault. Perhaps the truth we both missed was that faith and fortification are not opposites, but complementary aspects of the same protective impulse." Working together, the two Primarchs began constructing something unprecedented, fortress shrines that were as much spiritual sanctuaries as they were physical defenses. Perturabo's engineering genius provided structures that could withstand demon assault, while Lorgar's understanding of human nature created spaces where souls could find peace and purpose. These hybrid constructions became staging areas for the redemption effort, places where Space Marines from all the redeeming legions could gather to share knowledge, coordinate operations, and find strength in numbers. More importantly, they served as proof that the Primarch's transformation was not merely personal, but institutional, a fundamental change in how they approached their role as humanity's protectors. Yet it was Angron who emerged as the most unexpected source of strength for his struggling brothers. The Red Angel, freed from the constant rage that had defined his existence for centuries, had discovered depths of compassion and wisdom that none of his brothers had suspected. Where once he had been the most volatile and unpredictable of their number, he now served as an anchor of stability in the storms of doubt and temptation that threatened to overwhelm them. When Conrad Kurz's precognitive visions became so overwhelming that the Night Haunter began to lose himself in the maze of competing possibilities, it was Angron who reached out to steady his brother's tormented mind. The former gladiator's experience with overwhelming mental anguish, his intimate knowledge of what it meant to have one's thoughts dominated by forces beyond mortal control, made him uniquely qualified to understand Kurz's suffering. "I know what it is to see only darkness," Angron said, his massive frame dwarfing even Kurz's considerable height as they stood together in the Night Lord's private chambers. "To believe that the visions in your mind represent the only possible future. But I have learned something in my journey toward redemption, that sight is not the same as understanding, and understanding is not the same as acceptance. You see the futures where we fail," he continued, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned to master his own demons. "But do you see the choices that lead to those failures? Do you see the moments where different decisions might lead to different outcomes? The future is not a destination, brother. It is a path, and we choose our direction with every step." Kors looked up at the brother who had once been considered the least wise among them, seeing in Angron's eyes a peace that the Night Haunter's tormented visions had never shown him. How do you bear it? The weight of what you have done, the knowledge of what you could have become? When I look into the possible futures, I see our redemption leading to outcomes as terrible as any we achieved through damnation. By remembering that the weight is not mine alone, Angron replied. I carried my guilt in isolation for centuries, let it fester into rage that consumed everything I touched. But now I share that burden with 8 brothers who understand the cost of our choices because they have paid it themselves. The shame becomes bearable when it is divided among those who love you despite your failures. The conversation marked a turning point for both Primarchs. Curz's visions began to stabilize as he learned to focus not on the inevitability of various outcomes, but on the choices that determined which future would come to pass. Angron, meanwhile, found in his role as counselor and protector a purpose that his gladiator training had always pointed toward, but that his corruption had perverted into mindless violence. The deepening bonds between the Primarchs created opportunities that none of them had possessed as individuals. When intelligence reports reached them of Imperial prisoners being held in Chaos strongholds throughout the sector, they were able to coordinate rescue operations that would have been impossible for any single fleet to accomplish. The first target was a demon world, where word-bearers loyal to Erebus had established slave camps, using captured Imperial Guard regiments as raw material for corruption rituals. The prison complex was heavily defended, protected by overlapping fields of demon-infested energy and patrolled by entities that existed solely to inflict suffering on mortal souls. Yet the redeeming Primarchs approached the problem not as individual champions, but as a coordinated force. Magnus provided psychic reconnaissance that mapped the facility's defenses. Mortarion's expertise in surviving hostile environments allowed the strike force to operate in the daemon world's corrupted atmosphere. Perturabo's tactical genius identified the weak points in the stronghold's construction, while Lorgar's understanding of word-bearer psychology revealed the patterns of their former brothers' patrol routes. Angron led the actual assault, his newfound wisdom allowing him to inspire the mixed companies of redeemed space marines with words rather than example. Fulgrim coordinated the extraction of prisoners, his perfect understanding of human psychology helping to calm traumatized survivors. The Alpha Legion twins provided diversions that kept the facility's defenders focused away from the primary assault. Most importantly, Conrad Curz's stabilized visions guided the entire operation, his precognitive sight revealing the crucial moments where success or failure would be determined. For the first time in his long existence, the Night Haunter's gift served to prevent tragedy rather than predict it. The rescue was a complete success, with over 3,000 Imperial prisoners liberated from conditions that defied description. Yet the true victory was not tactical, but spiritual, proof that the redeeming Primarchs could work together to serve something greater than their individual ambitions. The prisoners themselves, men and women who had endured torture and corruption that should have broken their minds completely, found themselves face to face with legends they had been taught to fear and hate. Yet what they saw was not the demon princes of chaos propaganda, but broken giants who wept openly at the suffering that had been inflicted in their names. "We cannot undo what was done to you," Mortarion said, as Death Guard apothecaries worked to heal the worst of the prisoners' injuries. "We cannot restore the years stolen from your lives or resurrect the comrades who died beside you, but we can ensure that your sacrifice was not meaningless, that your suffering helps to forge something better than what came before." The rescued Imperial forces became the first witnesses to the Primarch's transformation, living proof that redemption was not just possible but actively being pursued. Their testimonies, transmitted through astropathic networks throughout the Imperium, carried more weight than any official proclamation could have achieved. More rescue operations followed, each one demonstrating new aspects of the Primarch's coordinated efforts. A strike against an Emperor's Children pleasure barge liberated a company of Sisters of Battle who had been subjected to sensory experiments designed to break their faith. An assault on an Iron Warriors fortress freed several hundred Imperial Navy personnel who had been forced to build weapons for use against their former comrades. With each successful operation, the bonds between the redeeming Primarchs grew stronger. They shared not just tactical knowledge, but their deepest fears and shames, finding in confession a path toward healing that none of them had expected. Magnus spoke of his terror that his quest for knowledge would damn everyone he tried to help. Mortarion admitted his horror at how easily he had embraced the very corruption he had spent his youth fighting against. Angron wept for the brothers who had died because he could not control his rage. "We were all afraid," Fulgrim observed during one of their regular communions, his voice carrying harmonics that spoke of genuine understanding rather than artificial perfection. "Afraid that we were not worthy of Father's love, afraid that we would fail in our duties, afraid that the galaxy was too dark for any light to survive. That fear made us vulnerable to promises that seemed to offer certainty in place of doubt." "Perhaps that is the true lesson of our fall," Alpharius added, his words echoed by Omegon in perfect synchrony. "Not that we were weak or flawed, but that we tried to carry burdens that were meant to be shared. We sought individual perfection when we should have pursued collective strength." The truth of those words was demonstrated daily as the combined efforts of 9 Primarchs achieved victories that would have been impossible for any one of them alone. They had become not just brothers in blood, but partners in the truest sense, each one's strengths compensating for the other's weaknesses, each one's wisdom helping to guide the others away from the pitfalls that had trapped them during their individual journeys toward damnation. Yet even as hope began to flourish in the darkness between stars, the Primarchs knew that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. The Chaos Gods had not abandoned their pursuit, and the Imperium itself remained suspicious of their intentions. Most significantly, they faced the question of whether their transformation was permanent or merely another phase in a longer cycle of fall and redemption. "We have proven that we can work together in crisis," Magnus observed during one of their strategic conferences. "But can we maintain this unity when the immediate threats have passed? Can we rebuild not just our own souls, but the trust that our betrayal shattered?" The question hung in the space between stars like a challenge and a promise, a reminder that redemption was not a destination, but a path that required constant choice. Yet for the first time since the heresy's end, 9 brothers walked that path together, their combined light pushing back against a darkness that had seemed absolute for far too long. The debate that would reshape the Imperium's future began not in the grand council chambers of Terra, but in the cramped strategium of Robut Guilliman's flagship, as it prowled the edges of the maelstrom. The Lord of Ultramar stood before a gathering of his fellow loyalist Primarchs, their faces illuminated by the cold light of tactical displays that showed the impossible. Traitor Legion fleets moving to liberate Imperial prisoners rather than claiming them as slaves. "The evidence is undeniable," Guilliman said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries spent governing worlds and analyzing intelligence reports. "Magnus has broken his pacts with Tzeentch. Mortarion has purged Nurgle's corruption from his forces. Angron has removed the butcher's nails that drove him to madness. These are not the actions of beings seeking to deceive us, but of sons attempting to find their way back to the light." Rogel Dawn, his scarred features bearing the accumulated weight of the siege of Terra, responded with the pragmatic skepticism that had sustained the Imperium through its darkest hours. Actions can be feigned, brother. Chaos is patient, and its servants have had millennia to perfect their deceptions. What appears to be redemption might simply be the opening move in a stratagem so complex we cannot perceive its true purpose. The Imperial Fist's Primarch gestured to the tactical displays, his augmetic hand clicking against the control surfaces with mechanical precision. Consider the pattern. They fragment their own legions, apparently weakening themselves while creating splinter factions that remain loyal to chaos. They rescue Imperial prisoners, gaining intelligence about our defensive positions and supply lines. They seek communication with us, potentially gathering information for future attacks. Every apparent act of redemption serves multiple strategic purposes. Vulcan's response came with the warmth that had always defined the Salamander's relationship with humanity. You speak of strategy, Rogel, but you forget the human element. I have read the testimonies of those they rescued. These are not the words of people who have been deceived or manipulated. They speak of primarchs who wept for the suffering inflicted in their names, who risked their lives to undo damage they had caused. That is not calculation. It is conscience. The debate had been raging for weeks as reports continued to flow in from across the galaxy. Imperial forces reported encounters with traitor Legion vessels that offered aid rather than demanding surrender. Astropaths transmitted messages from the redeeming Primarchs that spoke not of conquest, but of contrition. Most significantly, the Emperor's tarot itself had begun showing configurations that suggested hope rather than despair. Jagatai Khan, the White Scars Primarch, whose ships had been among the first to encounter the transformed fleets, offered his perspective with the directness that had always characterized his approach to complex problems. I have spoken with Magnus across the void. Not the demon prince who served Tzeentch's schemes, but the scholar who once sought knowledge to heal the galaxy's wounds. There is pain in his voice, brothers. Genuine regret for choices that cost us all dearly. Either he has become the greatest actor in galactic history, or he has truly found his way back to what he once was. Corvus Corax emerged from the shadows that always seemed to cling to him like a second skin, his voice carrying undertones of someone who had spent too many years hunting in darkness. I want to believe, Jagatai. The Emperor knows I want to believe that our lost brothers can be saved. But I have seen what chaos corruption can do, how deeply it can burrow into a soul before revealing its true nature. The question is not whether they appear redeemed, but whether that redemption can survive the pressures that will inevitably be brought to bear upon it. The Raven Guard Primarch activated a holographic display that showed the current disposition of Imperial forces throughout the sector. We are spread thin, our resources strained by centuries of war against the very enemies who now claim to seek forgiveness. If we open our arms to them, and they prove false, we hand them victory on a scale that their original betrayal never achieved. If we reject them and they prove genuine, we perpetuate a division that could heal the galaxy's oldest wounds. Leman Russ, who had arrived only days before aboard ships still bearing the scars of his latest campaign against Chaos forces, provided the perspective of someone who had spent decades hunting his fallen brothers. I have fought them, bled against them, watched them descend deeper into damnation with each passing year. Yet I have also remembered what they were before the heresy poisoned their hearts. Magnus was arrogant, and Magnus was foolish. But Magnus was never cruel. Mortarion was bitter, and Mortarion was stubborn. But Mortarion was never without honor. The Wolf King's eyes, pale as winter ice, swept across the gathering. If they have truly found their way back to what they once were, then we owe it to Father's memory to welcome them home. But if they have not, if this is merely another layer of the same deception that destroyed our family once before, then I will be the one to put them down. That is what brothers do. We carry the burden of impossible choices so that others do not have to. The discussion was interrupted by an urgent communication from the fleet's astropathic choir. Senior Navigator Vex materialized in the strategium via hololithic projection, her 3 eyes blazing with the strain of maintaining contact across impossible distances. "My lords," she said, her voice distorted by the psychic relay systems, "we are receiving a priority transmission from the redeeming fleets. They request a meeting, not a negotiation, but a reunion. They propose a neutral location where evidence of their transformation can be evaluated without risk to Imperial forces." Gilliman studied the transmission details, his analytical mind processing implications and contingencies with the speed that had made him the Imperium's greatest administrator. "Where do they propose this meeting take place?" "The Pharaohs," Vex replied, her voice carrying undertones of awe. "The ancient beacon that once guided Imperial fleets before the heresy's end. It has been dormant for centuries, but they claim Magnus can reactivate it using purified psychic techniques. They offer to approach alone, without fleets or escorts, trusting their lives to our judgment." The silence that followed was profound, each Primarch contemplating the magnitude of what had been proposed. The Pharaohs had been one of the Great Crusade's greatest achievements, a xenotech beacon that had enabled faster-than-light communication across vast distances. Its loss during the heresy had been mourned as a symbol of everything the Civil War had cost humanity. "It could be a trap," Dawn observed, his fortress builder's mind automatically analyzing the tactical implications. "The Pharos is in contested space, surrounded by chaos-held systems. They could have fleets hidden throughout the sector, waiting to spring an ambush once we commit forces to the meeting. Or it could be proof of their sincerity," Vulcan countered. "If Magnus can truly reactivate the Pharos using purified techniques, it would demonstrate that his break with Tzeentch is complete. More than that, it would give the Imperium a strategic asset we have sorely missed." Khan's response came with the wisdom of someone who had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of galactic politics. "There is only one way to determine truth from deception. We meet them, but we do so prepared for either possibility. If they prove genuine, we welcome them back to the family they should never have left. If they prove false, we end this charade once and for all." The vote that followed was closer than any of them had expected. Guilliman, Vulcan, and Khan argued for cautious acceptance. Dawn and Corax insisted on assuming deception until proven otherwise. Russ remained uncommitted, his loyalty torn between hope for his lost brothers and duty to the Imperium they had betrayed. In the end, it was a message from Terra itself that decided the matter. The Emperor, despite his entombment upon the Golden Throne, managed to transmit a single word through the layers of psychic interference that surrounded the throne world. "Go." The meeting that followed would be remembered as either the moment when the Imperium began to heal its oldest wounds, or the greatest trap in galactic history. 9 loyalist Primarchs, accompanied by carefully chosen escorts, approached the Pharos beacon through space that reeked of chaos, corruption, and ancient betrayal. They found the redeeming Primarchs waiting exactly as promised. Alone, unescorted, their ships powered down to minimal levels as gestures of trust. Magnus stood on the command deck of the Photep, his single eye blazing with light that held no trace of Tzeentch's influence. Mortarion breathed clean air for the first time in centuries, his massive frame no longer racked by Nurgle's gifts. Angron wept openly at the sight of brothers he had not seen since the day he chose rage over reconciliation. The first words were Magnus's, transmitted across the void with psychic clarity that carried emotional truth no Vox system could achieve. Brothers, I know I have no right to ask for forgiveness. We have no right to expect trust. But we offer you something that words alone cannot provide. Proof of what we have become, purchased with everything we once were. The Crimson King raised his hands toward the ancient beacon, and for the first time in millennia, the Pharos blazed with light that reached across the galaxy. Not the corrupted radiance that chaos sorcery might have provided, but clean, pure illumination that cut through the warp's turbulent currents, like a knife through fog. Navigation throughout the sector suddenly became possible again. Communication relays that had been silent since the heresy's end crackled to life. Most importantly, the psychic resonance of the beacon carried with it an unmistakable signature, the Emperor's own will, reflected and amplified through techniques that drew power from loyalty rather than rebellion. Vulcan was the first to respond, the Salamander Primarch's voice carrying warmth that had sustained the Imperium through its darkest hours. Brother, oh my brothers, welcome home. Yet even as reunion began, the challenges that lay ahead became apparent. Dawn's suspicions, while proven wrong in this instance, reflected concerns shared by billions of Imperial citizens who had suffered under Traitor Legion attacks. Corax's warnings about the fragility of redemption proved prophetic, as several of the redeeming Primarchs struggled with the emotional weight of seeing brothers they had betrayed. Most significantly, the reactivation of the Pharos sent shock waves through the warp that attracted the attention of every chaos force in the sector. The beacon that had once been a symbol of Imperial unity now became a target for entities that viewed the Primarch's reunion as an existential threat to their power. This is only the beginning, Guilliman observed, as the Loyalist and Redeeming fleets began the complex process of coordination. We have proven that redemption is possible, that the wounds of the heresy can begin to heal. But proof is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as trust. The galaxy will test our reunion at every step, seeking to prove that some divisions cannot be mended. Magnus nodded, his massive frame somehow diminished by the weight of what lay ahead. Then we will meet every test, brother, not as the perfect beings we once pretended to be, but as the flawed sons who have learned that strength comes not from isolation, but from unity. We have a chance to be the family Father always intended us to be. That chance is worth any price we might be asked to pay. The words carried across both fleets, reaching Space Marines who had spent millennia believing their Primarchs lost forever, and others who had never dared hope that redemption might be possible. In the combined light of 18 Primarchs standing together for the first time since the heresy's beginning, shadows that had haunted the galaxy for centuries began to lift. Yet in the depths of the Eye of Terror, where reality bent to the will of mad gods, ancient powers stirred with fury that shook the foundations of existence itself. The great game had entered its final phase, and the stakes had risen beyond mere conquest or corruption to encompass the very nature of good and evil, redemption and damnation, hope and despair. The reunion of the Emperor's sons had begun, but its ultimate outcome remained balanced on the edge of a blade that could cut either toward salvation or toward an ending more complete than any the galaxy had yet imagined. The galaxy convulsed as powers older than human civilization made their final gambit for dominion over reality itself. The Chaos Gods, who had spent millennia as rivals, united only by their opposition to order, now stood together in unprecedented alliance. The great game that had entertained them since the universe's youth was suspended in favor of a singular purpose: the complete destruction of redemption as a concept, the final proof that souls once claimed by chaos could never truly be free. The opening move came not as whispers in the dark or subtle corruption seeping through vulnerable minds, but as a wound torn in reality's fabric. The Eye of Terror, that great maelstrom of pure chaos that had festered in the galaxy's heart since the heresy's end, began to expand with terrifying speed. Systems that had stood on its borders for millennia were consumed in moments, their populations transformed into raw materials for the greatest demon army ever assembled. At the Pharos beacon, where 18 Primarchs stood united for the first time in memory, the psychic shockwave struck like a hammer blow to the soul. The ancient xenotech device that had moments before blazed with pure light suddenly flickered as competing influences battled for control of its mechanisms. "They mean to end this once and for all," Magnus declared, his single eye blazing with effort as he struggled to maintain the beacon's stability. "Not just our redemption, but the very possibility of redemption. They would prove that change itself is impossible, that the universe is locked in eternal stagnation, punctuated only by decay. Mortarion, his purified form standing steady against psychic winds that would have shattered normal minds, added his strength to his brother's efforts. Then we give them the proof they seek, but not the proof they expect. We show them that some things are worth preserving, worth fighting for, worth dying for if necessary." The response from the loyalist Primarchs was immediate and unequivocal. Vulcan's voice carried the warmth of forge fires that had sustained his legion through the darkest campaigns. "We stand together, brothers. Whatever comes, we face it as the family father intended us to be." Yet even as the Primarchs prepared for battle, something unprecedented began to manifest in the space between stars. Horus Lupercal's spirit, fragments of which had been scattered across the warp since his death, suddenly coalesced with a strength that defied every law of spiritual existence. The War Master stood before his brothers, not as flesh and blood, but as pure will given form, his presence a blazing beacon of regret transformed into purpose. "My sons," he said, his voice carrying across 18 fleets without need for Vox transmission. "My brothers, I have watched your struggle from the spaces between life and death, felt your pain as you fought to free yourselves from the same chains that bound me. Now I ask you to let me lead one final time, not toward conquest, but toward the light I was too proud to see when it mattered most." The effect of Horus's manifestation rippled across both the material and immaterial realms. Space Marines who had served in the Sons of Horus before the Legion's fracturing fell to their knees, overwhelmed by the sight of their Primarch, restored not as a demon prince, but as something approaching his original glory. Yet this was not the charismatic conqueror who had led the Great Crusade's spearhead, but a being tempered by genuine understanding of the cost his choices had inflicted on the galaxy. "I cannot undo what I did," Horus continued, his spectral form somehow managing to embrace each of his brothers in turn. "I cannot restore the lives lost or heal the wounds my rebellion carved into the Imperium's heart. But I can stand with you now, in this moment when everything we were meant to protect hangs in the balance." The Chaos God's response was swift and terrible. 4 greater demon legions materialized around the Pharos, each one led by an avatar of their respective patron deity. These were not the lesser entities that had plagued the galaxy for millennia, but direct manifestations of powers that had shaped reality since its birth. Tzeentch's champion was change incarnate, its form shifting between possibilities so rapidly that mortal eyes could not track its movements. It spoke with voices that belonged to every Primarch, simultaneously, offering each one visions of what they might have achieved if only they had been willing to pay the price in souls that true power demanded. Khorne's avatar was pure violence given form, a being of brass and blood that existed solely to prove that strength was the only currency that mattered in a universe built on conflict. It challenged the Primarchs to single combat, promising glorious death to those brave enough to face it, and shameful defeat to those who refused. Nurgle's herald was entropy itself, its bloated form radiating a despair so profound that it made redemption seem not just impossible but meaningless. It whispered that all struggles ended in decay, all victories crumbled into defeat, all hope rotted into resignation, given sufficient time. Slaaneish's champion embodied every excess, every sensation pushed beyond mortal comprehension. It prompted the avatar of the blood god, faced with violence motivated by love rather than hate, found its attacks blunted by techniques that turned aggression into defense. Fulgrim faced Slaaneish's herald in single combat that was as much artistic performance as battle, each movement perfectly calculated to demonstrate the difference between excellence and excess. Where the demon sought to overwhelm through sensation, the Phoenician responded with beauty so pure that it made corruption recoil from its presence. The battle raged across multiple planes of existence simultaneously, reality itself becoming a battlefield where concepts fought for dominance. Order clashed with chaos, not as abstract principles, but as living forces, each backed by beings whose will had shaped the galaxy's destiny for millennia. At the center of the storm, the Emperor himself acted with directness that he had not displayed since the heresy's end. The Golden Throne's mechanisms groaned as vast amounts of psychic energy were redirected from sustaining the Astronomicon to shielding his sons from the worst of the Chaos assault. Across the Imperium, navigation became impossible as the guiding light that had sustained interstellar travel flickered and dimmed. Yet the cost was willingly paid, for the Emperor could see what his sons could not, that this battle would determine not just their individual fates, but the fundamental nature of the universe itself. If redemption could survive the direct assault of all four Chaos gods working in concert, then hope itself would become a force as powerful as any daemon army. The turning point came when Horus's spirit, drawing strength from his brother's unity, challenged the very concept of inevitable damnation that the Chaos gods represented. The War Master, who had once been their greatest champion, now stood as living proof that even the most complete corruption could be overcome by genuine repentance, backed by familial love. "You promised me power," he declared, his voice somehow audible above the cosmic storm that raged around the battlefield. "You delivered slavery. You promised me truth, and you gave me lies wrapped in certainty. You promised me the strength to protect what I loved, and you used that strength to destroy it. But I have learned something you cannot understand, that admitting failure is the first step toward genuine strength." The demon avatars recoiled from Horus's words as if they were physical blows, their forms flickering as the absolute certainty that had sustained them was challenged by doubt. For the first time in their existence, the Chaos gods faced a champion who had experienced both their gifts and their costs, who could speak with the authority of someone who had been everything they promised and found it wanting. The battle's climax came when all 18 Primarchs joined their power together, their individual strengths combining into something greater than the sum of its parts. Loyalist and redeeming, living and spectral, they became a single force directed by a single purpose, the protection of something precious that chaos could never understand or destroy. The psychic resonance of their unity rippled across the galaxy, touching every human soul capable of hope. On Terra, the golden throne blazed with light that had not been seen since the Emperor first claimed his place upon it. Throughout the Imperium, populations that had known only war and despair suddenly felt something they had thought lost forever. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. Yet even this is not the end, Magnus observed, his voice heavy with the weight of prescience that had nothing to do with Tzeentch's influence. It is barely the beginning. We have proven that redemption is possible, that even the Chaos Gods can be defied. But proof is not the same as acceptance, and acceptance is not the same as trust. Guilliman nodded, his analytical mind already processing the implications of what they had achieved. The galaxy will test us at every step, seeking to prove that unity is impossible, that the wounds of the heresy run too deep to heal. We must be prepared to face not just external enemies, but our own doubts, our own fears about whether we deserve the chance we have been given. Yet, as the combined fleets began the journey back toward Imperial space, there was something in the void that had not been there before, a sense of possibility that transcended mere hope. The great game had entered a new phase, one where the rules themselves were subject to change. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, the Chaos Gods retreated to lick wounds that would take eons to heal. They had thrown everything they possessed at 9 wayward champions and failed to reclaim them. For the first time since the galaxy's youth, they faced the possibility that their dominion was not absolute, that there were forces in the universe they could not corrupt or control. The war for the galaxy's soul was far from over, but for the first time in memory, those who fought for light had reason to believe that darkness need not be eternal. The Emperor's sons were coming home, not as the perfect beings they had once pretended to be, but as the flawed, wise, genuinely united family they had always been meant to become. Victory tasted of ashes and tears, its price measured not in worlds conquered, but in pieces of souls freely sacrificed upon the altar of redemption. As the cosmic storm that had raged around the Pharos beacon finally subsided, the true cost of defying the Chaos Gods became apparent to all who had witnessed the battle. The 18 Primarchs who had stood united against the forces of damnation were reduced in number, their ranks diminished by losses that cut deeper than any mere physical wound. Conrad Kurz was the first to fall, his tortured form finally finding peace as the weight of infinite visions collapsed his already strained psyche. The Night Haunter had spent his final moments not in madness, but in clarity, his precognitive sight finally showing him a future worth believing in. Yet the effort of holding that vision steady while his brothers fought for their souls had burned out the neural pathways that sustained his consciousness. "Justice," he whispered, as his massive frame crumpled to the deck of his flagship, his words somehow carrying to every corner of the combined fleets. Not the cruel mockery I practiced, but the gentle truth I glimpsed in Father's eyes when first we met. I die having seen it. And that is enough. The Night Lords who witnessed their Primarchs passing found themselves changed in ways that went beyond grief. The visions of justice without cruelty that had driven their Gene Father to his redemption became their inheritance, a legacy that would reshape their legion's identity in the years to come. They were no longer the agents of terror they had been, but guardians of a hope their Primarch had died to preserve. Alpharius followed soon after, his connection with Omegon proving both blessing and curse, as the psychic feedback from the battle overloaded the neural link that bound the twin souls. The Alpha Legion Primarch sacrificed himself to shield his brother from the worst of the spiritual backlash, his final act one of selfless protection rather than labyrinthine manipulation. "Tell them," Alpharius gasped as his form began to fade. "Tell them the last secret was the simplest one. That love is the only truth that matters, the only strategy that cannot be defeated by greater cunning." Omegon survived, but forever diminished, his power reduced to barely above that of an exceptionally gifted space marine. The twin who remained carried within himself the memories and regrets of both, a living repository of everything the Alpha Legion had been and everything it might yet become. Yet these were not the only losses. Lorgar, his soul already strained by his earlier destruction of the Book of Lorgar, found himself unable to fully recover from the psychic trauma of facing all 4 Chaos gods simultaneously. The word-bearer Primarch lived, but his ability to inspire faith through speech was gone, replaced by a humility so profound that words became unnecessary. "I spent centuries seeking the divine in distant powers," he said, as he knelt among the wreckage of the Pharos beacon, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yet I never recognized it in the faces of those who looked to me for guidance. Perhaps silence will teach me what eloquence could not." The surviving Primarchs bore their own scars, wounds that went beyond the physical to touch the very essence of what they were. Magnus the Red, his psychic might diminished, but his wisdom greatly expanded, found that his understanding of the warp's mysteries had been purified of the corruption that had once tainted it. He could no longer reshape reality with a thought, but he could guide others toward knowledge without the pride that had once damned him. Mortarian's purification was complete, his form cleansed of every trace of Nurgle's influence, yet the process had left him fundamentally changed. Where once he had been among the most physically powerful of the Primarchs, now his strength lay in his ability to endure suffering and transform it into healing. He had become not a lord of death, but a guardian of life, his very presence capable of purifying corruption wherever it was found. Angron, freed from the butcher's nails and the rage they had fostered, discovered depths of compassion that surprised even his brothers. Yet the surgical removal of the cybernetic implants had cost him much of his supernatural strength and speed. He was still formidable, still a Primarch, but he was also genuinely vulnerable in ways he had not been for centuries. I sought to become perfect," he said, as he surveyed the aftermath of the battle. "But I confused perfection with flawlessness. True perfection lies not in the absence of weaknesses, but in the courage to acknowledge them and grow beyond them." Perturabo's transformation was perhaps the most profound of all. The Lord of Iron had expended so much of his essential nature in the battle that his ability to create weapons of war was virtually gone. Yet in its place had emerged a gift for construction that transcended mere engineering, the capacity to build not just structures but communities, not just fortresses but homes. "I spent millennia learning to tear things down," he said, as he worked alongside his iron warriors to repair the damaged beacon. "Perhaps it is time I learned to build things up." The Eye of Terror itself bore the scars of the cosmic conflict, its chaotic energies stabilized by forces it could not comprehend or control. The great wound in reality didn't close. Perhaps it never could, given the magnitude of the damage the heresy had inflicted upon the galaxy's spiritual fabric. Yet it no longer expanded with malevolent intent, its borders fixed by a will greater than the sum of the Chaos God's fury. Within its depths, demon worlds that had existed since the heresy's beginning found themselves subject to new laws, new possibilities. Some began to heal, their corrupted surfaces giving way to environments that could support uncorrupted life. Others simply became stable, no longer shifting according to the whims of their patron deities. The surviving redeemed Primarchs, their fleets battered but their purpose clarified, began the long journey back toward Terra. They carried with them not the arrogance of conquerors, but the humility of penitents, souls who had looked into the abyss of their own corruption and chosen to climb back toward the light. The first destination was not the Imperial Palace, but a small shrine world on the outer edges of the Sol system, a place where pilgrims had come for millennia to pray for the Emperor's mercy. Here, in a simple chapel that could have held no more than a few hundred worshippers, 16 Primarchs knelt before an image of their father and offered the only gift they had left to give, genuine contrition. "We cannot undo what we did," Magnus spoke for all of them, his words carrying across the chapel's acoustics with perfect clarity. "We cannot restore the lives lost, or heal all the wounds our rebellion carved into the Imperium's heart. But we can dedicate what remains of our existence to serving the vision we betrayed, protecting the humanity we endangered, building the future we nearly destroyed." The response came not in words, but in a presence that filled the chapel like sunlight after storm. The Emperor, his consciousness somehow reaching across the void from his throne on Terra, touched each of his returned sons with forgiveness so profound it reduced grown Primarchs to weeping children. Yet even that moment of grace came at a cost. On Terra, the Golden Throne's mechanisms strained as the Emperor expended psychic energy he could ill afford to lose. The already weakened master of mankind grew weaker still, his hold on life more tenuous than it had been since the day Horus struck him down. The High Lords of Terra, monitoring the throne's output with instruments that had recorded no change for centuries, watched in growing alarm as power levels dropped to critical minimums. New measures would need to be taken, new systems developed, if the Emperor was to survive the effort of forgiving his wayward sons. "The price of mercy," observed Malcador the Sigillite's recorded voice, playing from archives that had been sealed since his death during the heresy. "Always higher than the cost of judgment, yet infinitely more valuable than either." Across the galaxy, the effects of the Primarch's redemption rippled outward like stones cast into still water. Imperial worlds that had known only war and despair for millennia suddenly found themselves touched by possibilities they had never dared imagine. The psychic resonance of genuine forgiveness offered and accepted created currents in the warp that pushed back against the darkness that had dominated the Imperium since the heresy's end. Navigator houses reported that travel through the warp was becoming easier, the chaotic currents that had made long-distance voyages so perilous beginning to settle into more predictable patterns. Astropathic communication, disrupted for centuries by the screaming of tormented souls, grew clearer as the collective anguish of the galaxy's psychic population began to heal. Yet the changes were not universally welcomed. Imperial governors who had built their power on the certainty of eternal war found their positions threatened by populations that suddenly believed peace might be possible. Ecclesiarchs who had preached the necessity of hatred toward the alien, the mutant, and the heretic struggled to adapt their doctrine to a universe where redemption had been proven possible. Most significantly, the surviving Chaos warbands that had broken away from the redeemed legions found themselves increasingly isolated. Without the backing of their patron Primarchs, lacking the legitimacy that came from genetic lineage, they were reduced to mere pirates and raiders. Some began to surrender, seeking their own paths toward redemption. Others retreated deeper into the eye of terror, clinging to corruption that no longer offered the power it once had. The Death Guard who had followed Typhus found their diseases no longer spreading as easily, their plagues met by antibodies that seemed to spring from the very air around purified Imperial worlds. The World Eaters berserkers who had chosen Khorne over Angron discovered that their rage rang hollow, their fury unable to ignite the same response in populations that had begun to remember what peace felt like. Even the true Chaos Space Marine legions, those that had never known loyalist Primarchs, felt the change. The Black Legion, the Word-bearers who served Erebus, the Iron Warriors who followed Kroger, all found their recruiting efforts hampered by a galaxy that was slowly beginning to believe that damnation was not inevitable. In the depths of the Eye of Terror, the Chaos gods licked wounds that would take eons to fully heal. They had expended more power in their failed gambit than they had used since the universe's birth, and the failure had cost them something more precious than strength, certainty. For the first time since their rise to prominence, they faced the possibility that their dominion was not absolute, that there were forces in existence they could not corrupt or control. Yet even in defeat, they began to adapt. New strategies emerged from the rubble of the old, subtler approaches that acknowledged the changed nature of the battlefield. If redemption was possible, then perhaps corruption could be made more insidious. If forgiveness could heal ancient wounds, then perhaps new wounds could be inflicted that cut deeper than any blade. The great game continued, but its rules had been fundamentally altered. The Primarchs who had once served as Chaos's greatest champions were now arrayed against them. Their knowledge of corruption turned toward the service of purification. The galaxy that had seemed on the brink of eternal darkness now carried within it seeds of light that might yet bloom into salvation. The war for humanity's soul was far from over, but for the first time in memory, those who fought for light had reason to believe that victory was possible. The Emperor's sons had come home, not as the perfect beings they had once pretended to be, but as the wounded, wise, genuinely repentant family they had always been meant to become. The price of forgiveness had been paid in full, measured not in coin or blood, but in pieces of divine essence, freely offered upon the altar of love. What remained was to discover whether that sacrifice had been sufficient to heal wounds that had festered for 10,000 years, or whether the cost of redemption had merely changed the nature of the conflict without ending it. The galaxy that emerged from the ashes of cosmic conflict was fundamentally changed, its very nature transformed by forces that few had believed possible. Where once the Imperium had been defined by its division from the traitor legions, now it faced the unprecedented challenge of reintegration, of learning to trust brothers who had been enemies for longer than most civilizations had existed. The process began not with grand proclamations or ceremonial reconciliations, but with the quiet work of individuals choosing hope over hatred. On Macraga, Robut Gilliman stood beside Magnus the Red in the great library of the fortress of Hera, their combined wisdom working to revise the Codex Astartes in ways that would accommodate the return of the lost legions. The old structures were built for a galaxy at war with itself, Guilliman observed, as he reviewed tactical doctrines that had been developed to fight the very forces that now sought to serve the Imperium once more. We must create new frameworks that acknowledge what we have learned, that strength comes not from uniformity, but from unity, not from rigid adherence to doctrine, but from adaptable response to changing circumstances. Magnus nodded, his single eye reflecting wisdom purchased at a price that still haunted his dreams. Knowledge shared is knowledge multiplied, brother. The techniques we developed for resisting chaos corruption, the methods we discovered for purifying tainted souls, these must become part of our common heritage, not secrets hoarded by individual legions. The process of integration was neither swift nor simple, Former traitor legions found themselves subjected to scrutiny that went beyond mere suspicion to encompass genuine attempts to understand how redemption might be maintained across the centuries and millennia to come. Each company, each squad, each individual space marine underwent evaluation not to determine guilt or innocence. Those questions had been settled in the cosmic battle that had claimed 2 Primarchs and diminished all the rest, but to assess their readiness to serve humanity's highest ideals rather than their own ambitions. The Death Guard faced perhaps the greatest challenges, their very nature transformed by their journey from servants of decay to guardians of life. Mortarion worked alongside apothecaries from across the Imperium to develop new techniques for healing not just physical wounds, but spiritual ones, methods that could purify corruption at its source rather than simply treating its symptoms. "We who served entropy must now serve growth," he declared to his assembled legion, his voice carrying across Vox networks to reach every Death Guard in the galaxy. "We who brought plague must now bring healing. It will be the work of lifetimes, perhaps centuries, but it is work worthy of the oath we swore when first we took up arms in humanity's defense." The World Eaters underwent their own transformation, guided by Angren's newfound wisdom and the techniques he had developed for transcending rage through discipline and purpose. The surgical removal of Butcher's nails became not just a medical procedure, but a spiritual rebirth, each World Eater who chose purification emerging as a protector rather than a destroyer. "Freedom is not the absence of chains," Angren taught those who came to him seeking guidance, "but the wisdom to choose which chains we will bear. We bind ourselves to duty, to honor, to the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. These are chains that strengthen rather than diminish, bonds that unite rather than isolate." The Emperor's children found their path toward redemption through the pursuit of excellence redefined, not the selfish perfection that Slaanesh had offered, but the selfless mastery that served others' needs rather than their own desires. Under Fulgrim's guidance, they became artisans of hope, using their skills to create works that inspired rather than corrupted, beauty that elevated rather than degraded. "True art serves truth," Fulgrim explained to those who struggled to understand the difference between their former goals and their current purpose. "It reveals the beauty that exists within reality, rather than the fantasies we might impose upon it. When we create to inspire others toward their own greatness, we participate in the same creative force that shaped the galaxy itself." The Iron Warriors faced the challenge of learning to build rather than destroy, their tactical genius redirected toward construction projects that would stand as monuments to human achievement rather than testaments to conquest. Perturabo's diminished but purified abilities proved perfectly suited to the task, his understanding of defensive architecture evolving into knowledge of how to create spaces where communities could flourish. "Every fortress I built in service to chaos was designed to keep enemies out," he reflected, as he worked alongside his legion to construct refugee settlements for populations displaced by centuries of war. "Now we build structures designed to welcome friends in." The difference is not just philosophical, it requires completely different approaches to space, to materials, to the relationship between those who dwell within and those who remain without. Yet perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred within the Thousand Suns, where Magnus's purified knowledge of the warp began to heal wounds that had festered since Prospero's burning. The rubric that had reduced so many of his sons to dust was slowly, carefully reversed through techniques that drew upon the same forces that had originally empowered the curse, but channeled them through purified intentions. "Knowledge without wisdom is destruction," Magnus taught the restored sorcerers who emerged from their dusty shells like butterflies from chrysalises. Wisdom without compassion is mere cleverness. But knowledge guided by wisdom in service to compassion, that is the foundation upon which we will rebuild not just our legion, but our relationship with the forces that shape reality itself. The surviving Alpha Legion, diminished by Alpharius's sacrifice, but still commanded by the wisdom Omegon had inherited from his twin, found their purpose in creating networks of communication and cooperation rather than espionage and sabotage. Their labyrinthine skills in organization and logistics proved invaluable in coordinating the massive effort required to reintegrate the former traitor legions into Imperial service. "We were masters of division," Omegon explained to those who questioned how warriors trained in deception could serve truth. "That very mastery teaches us how unity can be achieved, what bonds must be forged to replace the ones we learned to break. Every technique we use to sow discord can be reversed, turned toward the service of harmony rather than chaos." The Imperial response to these transformations was mixed, reflecting the complex emotions that arose from witnessing the impossible made manifest. Some worlds welcomed the redeemed legions with celebrations that lasted for weeks, their populations overwhelmed by joy at the prospect of peace after millennia of war. Others remained suspicious, their leaders demanding proof of sincerity that went beyond words or even deeds to encompass fundamental changes in the very nature of those who sought redemption. Yet gradually, as reports filtered back from worlds protected by redeemed space marines, as stories spread of former enemies becoming protectors, as the evidence accumulated that the transformation was genuine and lasting, acceptance began to grow. The process was neither universal nor uniform, but it was real, a slow healing of wounds that had seemed permanent. On Terra itself, within the Imperial Palace, where the Golden Throne hummed with energies that had sustained the Emperor for millennia, unprecedented changes began to manifest. The master of mankind, his psychic essence no longer strained by the constant effort of holding back the forces that sought his son's damnation, began to show signs of recovery that had seemed impossible since his entombment. The change was subtle at first, a slight increase in the Astronomican's brightness, a minor improvement in the psychic resonance that bound the Imperium together. Yet those who monitored the Golden Throne systems recognized the significance of these small improvements. For the first time since the heresy's end, the Emperor was not merely maintaining his existence, but actively healing from the wounds that had nearly destroyed him. The implications were staggering. If the Emperor could recover, if his condition was not the permanent stasis that had defined Imperial policy for centuries, then fundamental assumptions about the Imperium's future would need to be reconsidered. Hope, that most dangerous of emotions, began to take root in hearts that had known only duty and endurance for countless generations. Yet the galaxy's transformation brought with it new challenges that tested the redeemed Primarch's resolve in ways that their original corruption had not. Chaos, deprived of its greatest champions, adapted with the cunning that had sustained it through cosmic epochs. New strategies emerged from the eye of terror, subtler approaches that acknowledged the changed nature of the battlefield while seeking to exploit the very virtues that had enabled redemption. Cults arose that preached the worship of redemption itself, transforming a spiritual achievement into another form of idolatry. Demagogues claimed that the Primarch's transformation proved that corruption was temporary, that any sin could be forgiven, that moral restraints were unnecessary in a universe where even demon princes could find salvation. Most insidiously, new forms of doubt began to spread, whispers that suggested the redeemed primarchs were not truly free, but simply serving their chaos patrons in more effective ways. These rumors found fertile ground among populations that had suffered under Traitor Legion attacks, their skepticism providing chaos with new avenues for influence that did not require direct corruption. The redeemed primarchs met these challenges with the same unity that had enabled their original transformation. Magnus used his purified knowledge of the warp to identify and counter psychic influences that sought to corrupt redemption into its opposite. Mortarian's techniques for spiritual healing proved effective against the despair that fed on disappointed hopes. Angron's compassion provided comfort to those who struggled to believe that change was possible. Yet perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source: the Space Marine chapters that had remained loyal throughout the heresy and its aftermath. Veterans who had fought against the traitor legions for centuries found themselves working alongside former enemies, their experience providing crucial perspective on the difference between genuine transformation and elaborate deception. "We know what they were," declared Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists, addressing a gathering of mixed Imperial and redeemed forces. "We fought against them for lifetimes, bled against them on 1,000 battlefields, yet we also know what they have become, and the difference is not one of degree, but of fundamental nature. Those who served corruption sought to elevate themselves at others' expense. Those who have found redemption seek to elevate others at their own expense. The distinction is absolute." The sentiment was echoed across the galaxy as loyalist and redeemed forces learned to work together, their cooperation creating bonds that transcended the divisions of the past. Joint operations against chaos cults, collaborative efforts to rebuild war-torn worlds, shared training exercises that combined different doctrines and approaches, all contributed to a growing sense that the Imperium was not just surviving, but evolving into something greater than it had been before the heresy's wounds were inflicted. New threats emerged to test this unity. Alien empires that had remained dormant while humanity tore itself apart began to stir, recognizing that a united Imperium represented a challenge to their own ambitions. Necron tomb worlds awakened with timing that suggested more than coincidence, their mechanical intellects calculating that immediate action was required to prevent human unification from reaching critical mass. Yet these external challenges only served to strengthen the bonds between former enemies. When Orc wars descended upon worlds protected by both loyalist and redeemed Space Marines, they found themselves facing a coordinated defense that combined the best aspects of 18 different tactical doctrines. Tyrannid hive fleets encountered resistance that drew upon both the Imperium's traditional strengths and the hard-won wisdom of those who had experienced corruption and fought their way back to the light. The galaxy remained a dangerous place, filled with threats that could extinguish human civilization if met with anything less than absolute commitment to survival and growth. Yet for the first time in memory, humanity faced those threats not as a species divided against itself, but as a truly united force, guided by leaders who had learned from their mistakes, rather than being destroyed by them. The story that began with a single moment of clarity in the depths of despair had grown into something that encompassed the transformation of an entire galaxy. Yet its ending was not a conclusion, but a commencement, the beginning of an age where hope was not just a desperate fantasy, but a genuine possibility backed by the power of redemption, proven real. In the depths of space, where stellar winds carried the whispers of 1,000,000 worlds, the Emperor's sons stood watch over the civilization they had nearly destroyed and chosen instead to preserve. They were no longer the perfect beings they had once pretended to be. but they were something more valuable. Flawed, wise, genuinely united guardians of a future that remained uncertain, but was no longer without hope. The great game continued, its rules forever changed by forces that had refused to accept that corruption was inevitable. Chaos might adapt, aliens might threaten, and the universe itself might seem hostile to human dreams of peace and prosperity. Yet against all these challenges stood 18 Primarchs who had learned the most important lesson of all, that strength shared was strength multiplied, that unity freely chosen was stronger than bondage imposed by force, and that redemption, once achieved, became a source of power that no enemy could corrupt or destroy. The new dawn had begun, and its light would shine across the galaxy for ages yet to come.